This book contains up to 4 sides per cassette. Side 1. Conan the Conqueror by Robert E. Howard, edited by L. Sprague de Camp. Copyright 1967 by L. Sprague de Camp. Narrated by Jeff Halberstadt, this book contains 222 pages on 6 sides. If you would like to skip over any remaining announcements or introductory material, place your cassette player in fast forward until a beep is heard. Stop at that point to hear the table of contents, or at the second beep to locate the beginning of the book. Annotation. Conan the Barbarian, now in his 46th year, shows little signs of advancing age and has become the able ruler of Aquilonia through conquest. However, plotters in the neighboring kingdom of Nemedia plan to bring down the mighty warrior using evil sorcery. 1967. From the book jacket. Conan's awakening was abrupt and crystal clear. He possessed full knowledge of the battle in the mountains, and he had a good idea of where he was. He lay on a velvet couch, his limbs loaded with chains. Even he could not break. The figure seated on a silver throne-like chair before him seemed unreal, with a suggestion of more than human knowledge. "What the devil did you do to me?" demanded Conan. "I blasted your consciousness," answered Zaltotum. "How? You would not understand. Call it black magic, if you will." Conan felt a chill along his spine. Other books by Robert E. Howard: Chronological Order of the Conan series, Conan, Conan of Cimmeria, Conan the Freebooter, Conan the Wanderer, Conan the Adventurer, Conan the Buccaneer, Conan the Warrior, Conan the Usurper, Conan the Conqueror, Conan the Avenger, Conan of Aquilonia, Conan of the Isles. Illustrated Conan novels: Conan and the Sorcerer, Conan the Flame Knife, Conan the Mercenary, The Treasure of Tranikos. Other Conan novels: The Blade of Conan, The Spell of Conan. Contents. Introduction, Side 1. Conan the Conqueror, Side 1. Pages 6 and 7. A map of the world of Conan in the Hyborian Age, based upon notes and sketches by Robert E. Howard and upon previous maps by P. Schuyler Miller, John D. Clark, David Kyle, and L. Sprague de Camp, with a map of Europe and adjacent regions superimposed for reference. Introduction. Conan the Cimmerian is the hero of over 24 stories by Robert Irvin Howard, 1906 to 1936. Howard lived most of his short life in Cross Plains, Texas. There he turned out a huge volume of fiction for the pulp magazines: sport, detective, western, and oriental adventure stories. But the yarns for which he is most renowned are his heroic fantasies, especially the Conan tales. Heroic fantasy is a type of story of the supernatural laid in an imaginary world, either this planet as it is once supposed to have been, or as it will be long hence, or some other world or dimension, where magic works and all men are mighty, all women beautiful, all problems simple, and all life adventurous. The genre was developed by William Morris in the late 19th century and by Lord Dunsany and Eric R. Edison in the early 20th. Writing in the early 1930s, Howard was one of its strongest formative forces. 18 Conan stories were published during Howard's lifetime. Several others, from complete manuscripts to mere fragments, have been found among his papers since 1950. It has been my fortune to edit these last for publication, and to complete some that were incomplete or in the form of an outline only. Of all Howard's Conan stories, the present one is the only book-length novel. It is one of the last that he wrote before his lamented suicide, and forms a fitting climax to the series. It is worthy to stand beside such comparable works of heroic fantasy as E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros, Fletcher Pratt's The Well of the Unicorn, and J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring series. While it may be inferior to some of these in literary grace or philosophical profundity, it yields to none in action, color, excitement, and headlong drive. Although he had his faults as a writer, Howard was a natural storyteller. In reading the Conan stories, the reader gets the illusion that he is listening to the mighty adventurer himself, sitting before a fire and reeling off tales of his exploits. In fiction, the difference between a writer who is a natural storyteller and one who is not is like the difference between a boat that will float and one that will not. If the writer has the quality, we can forgive many other faults. If not, no other virtues can make up for this lack, any more than gleaming paint and shiny brass fittings on a boat make up for the fact that it cannot float. The present novel was originally published as a serial in Weird Tales, a magazine that carried, mixed with a lot of ephemeral trash, many stories of notably high literary quality. The present Conan story appeared under the title The Hour of the Dragon. When it was reprinted as a book, the name was changed to Conan the Conqueror. I have kept the latter title because while The Hour of the Dragon is intriguing, it has practically nothing to do with the narrative. I have made a few very small editorial changes in the story to eliminate inconsistencies in the original version. Conan lived, loved, and fought in Howard's imaginary Hyborian age, about 12,000 years ago, between the sinking of Atlantis and the beginnings of recorded history. A gigantic barbarian adventurer from the backward northern land of Cimmeria, Conan arrived as a youth in the kingdom of Zamora, Seamap, and for several years made a precarious living there and in neighboring lands as a thief. Then he served as a mercenary soldier, first in the oriental realm of Turan, and then in the Hyborian kingdoms. Forced to flee from Argos, Conan became a pirate along the coasts of Kush, in partnership with the Shemitish she-pirate Belit, and with a crew of black corsairs. After Belit's death, he returned to the trade of mercenary in Shem and the adjacent Hyborian kingdoms. Subsequently, he adventured among the nomadic outlaws of the eastern steppes, the pirates of the Sea of Vilayet, and the hill tribes of the Himalayan mountains on the borders of Iranistan and Vendia. After another stretch of soldiering in Koth and Argos, Conan went back to the sea, first as a pirate of the Baraka Isles, then as captain of a ship of the Zingaran buccaneers. When other buccaneers sank his ship, he returned to adventuring ashore in the Black Countries. He worked his way north and became a scout on the western frontier of Aquilonia, fighting the savage Picts. After rising to command in the Aquilonian army and defeating a Pictish invasion, Conan was lured back to Tarantia, the capital, and imprisoned by the jealous king Numedides. Escaping, he was chosen to lead a revolution against the worthless king. Conan slew Numedides on his own throne and became the ruler of the mightiest Hyborian kingdom. Conan soon found that being king was no bed of houris. A cabal of discontented nobles almost succeeded in assassinating him. By a ruse, the kings of Koth and Ophir trapped and imprisoned him in order to have a free hand in the conquest of Aquilonia. With the help of a fellow prisoner, a wizard, Conan escaped in time to turn the tables on the invaders. And the next adventure of Conan is the one chronicled in this present work. El Sprague de Camp. 1. O sleeper, awake. For nearly 2 years after the events of the Scarlet Citadel, Aquilonia flourishes under Conan's firm but tolerant rule. The lawless, hard-bitten adventurer of former years has, through force of circumstance, gradually matured into an able and responsible statesman. But a plot is brewing in the neighboring kingdom of Nemedia, and the plotters plan to bring down the king of Aquilonia by means of the sinister sorcery of an elder day. At this time, Conan is about 46 years old, showing few signs of age save the countless scars that crisscross his mighty frame, and a somewhat more cautious, deliberate approach to wine, women, and bloodshed than was the case in his uproarious youth. Although he keeps a harem of luscious concubines, he has never taken an official wife, a queen, and hence has no legitimate son to inherit the throne. His secret enemies mean to take full advantage of this fact. The long tapers flickered, sending the black shadows wavering along the walls, and the velvet tapestries rippled. Yet there was no wind in the chamber. 4 men stood about the ebony table on which lay the green sarcophagus that gleamed like carven jade. In the upraised right hand of each man, a curious black candle burned with a weird greenish light. Outside was night, and a lost wind moaning among the black trees. Inside the chamber was tense silence, and the wavering of the shadows, while 4 pairs of eyes, burning with intensity, were fixed on a long green case across which cryptic hieroglyphics writhed, as if lent life and movement by the unsteady light. The man at the foot of the sarcophagus leaned over it and moved his candle as if he were writing with a pen, inscribing a mystic symbol in the air. Then he set down the candle in its black gold stick at the foot of the case, and, mumbling some formula unintelligible to his companions, he thrust a broad white hand into his fur-trimmed robe. When he brought it forth again, it was as if he cupped in his palm a ball of living fire. The other 3 drew in their breath sharply, and the dark, powerful man who stood at the head of the sarcophagus whispered, "The heart of Ahriman." The other lifted a quick hand for silence. Somewhere a dog began howling dolefully, and a stealthy step padded outside the barred and bolted door. But none looked aside from the mummy case over which the man in the ermine-trimmed robe was now moving the great flaming jewel, while he muttered an incantation that was old when Atlantis sank. The glare of the gem dazzled their eyes so that they could not be sure of what they saw. But with a splintering crash, the carven lid of the sarcophagus burst outward as if from some irresistible pressure applied from within. And the 4 men, bending eagerly forward, saw the occupant, a huddled, withered, wizened shape with dried brown limbs like dead wood showing through moldering bandages. "Bring that thing back," muttered the small dark man who stood on the right with a short sardonic laugh. "It is ready to crumble at a touch. We are fools. Shh!" It was an urgent hiss of command from the large man who held the jewel. Perspiration stood upon his broad white forehead, and his eyes were dilated. He leaned forward and, without touching the thing with his hand, laid on the breast of the mummy the blazing jewel. Then he drew back and watched with fierce intensity, his lips moving in soundless invocation. It was as if a globe of living fire flickered and burned in the dead, withered bosom, and breath sucked in, hissing, through the clenched teeth of the watchers. For as they watched, an awful transmutation became apparent. The withered shape in the sarcophagus was expanding, was growing, lengthening. The bandages burst and fell into brown dust. The shriveled limbs swelled, straightened. Their dusky hue began to fade. "By Mitra!" whispered the tall, yellow-haired man on the left. He was not a Stygian. That part at least was true. Again a trembling finger warned for silence. The hound outside was no longer howling. He whimpered, as with an evil dream. And then that sound, too, died away in silence, in which the yellow-haired man plainly heard the straining of the heavy door, as if something outside pushed powerfully upon it. He half turned, his hand at his sword, but the man in the ermine robe hissed an urgent warning. "Stay! Do not break the chain, and on your life do not go to the door!" The yellow-haired man shrugged and turned back, and then he stopped short, staring. In the jade sarcophagus lay a living man, a tall, lusty man, naked, white of skin, and dark of hair and beard. He lay motionless, his eyes wide open, and blank and unknowing as a newborn babe's. On his breast the great jewel smoldered and sparkled. The man in ermine reeled as if from some letdown of extreme tension. "Ishtar," he gasped. "It is Zaltoton, and he lives! Valerius, Tarascus, Amaric, do you see? Do you see? You doubted me, but I have not failed. We have been close to the open gates of hell this night, and the shapes of darkness have gathered close about us. Aye, they followed him to the very door, but we have brought the great magician back to life." "And damned our souls to purgatory is everlasting, I doubt not," muttered the small dark man, Tarascus. The yellow-haired man, Valerius, laughed harshly. "What purgatory can be worse than life itself? So we are all damned together from birth. Besides, who would not sell his miserable soul for a throne?" "There is no intelligence in his stare, Orastes," said the large man. "He has long been dead," answered Orastes. "He is as one newly awakened. His mind is empty after the long sleep. Nay, he was dead, not sleeping. We brought his spirit back over the voids and gulfs of night and oblivion. I will speak to him. He bent over the foot of the sarcophagus, and fixing his gaze on the wide, dark eyes of the man within, he said slowly, "Awake, Zaltotun." The lips of the man moved mechanically. "Zaltotun," he repeated in a groping whisper. "You are Zaltotun," exclaimed Erastus, like a hypnotist driving home his suggestions. "You are Zaltotun of Python in Acheron." A dim flame flickered in the dark eyes. "I was Zaltotun," he whispered. "I am dead." "You are Zaltotun," cried Erastus. "You are not dead. You live." "I am Zaltotun," came the eerie whisper. "But I am dead. In my house in Chemi, in Stygia. There I died. And the priests who poisoned you mummified your body with their dark arts, keeping all your organs intact," exclaimed Erastus. "But now you live again. The heart of Ahriman has restored your life, drawn your spirit back from space and eternity." "The heart of Ahriman," the flame of remembrance grew stronger. "The barbarian stole it from me." "He remembers," muttered Erastus. "Lift him from the case." The others obeyed, hesitantly, as if reluctant to touch the man they had recreated, and they seemed not easier in their minds when they felt firm, muscular flesh, vibrant with blood and life, beneath their fingers. But they lifted him upon the table, and Erastus clothed him in a curious dark velvet robe, splashed with gold stars and crescent moons, and fastened a cloth of gold fillet about his temples, confining the black wavy locks that fell to his shoulders. He let them do as they would, saying nothing, not even when they set him in a carven throne-like chair with a high ebony back and wide silver arms, and feet like golden claws. He sat there motionless, and slowly intelligence grew in his dark eyes and made them deep and strange and luminous. It was as if long-sunken witch lights floated slowly up through midnight pools of darkness. Erastus cast a furtive glance at his companions, who stood staring in morbid fascination at their strange guest. Their iron nerves had withstood an ordeal that might have driven weaker men mad. He knew it was with no weaklings that he conspired, but men whose courage was as profound as their lawless ambitions and capacity for evil. He turned his attention to the figure in the ebon black chair, and this one spoke at last. "I remember," he said in a strong, resonant voice, speaking Nemedian with a curious, archaic accent. "I am Zaltotun, who was high priest of Set in Python, which was in Acheron. The heart of Ahriman. I dreamed I had found it again. Where is it?" Erastus placed it in his hand, and he drew breath deeply as he gazed into the depths of the terrible jewel, burning in his grasp. "They stole it from me long ago," he said. "The red heart of the night it is, strong to save or to damn. It came from afar and from long ago. While I held it, none could stand before me. But it was stolen from me, and Acheron fell, and I fled an exile into dark Stygia. Much I remember, but much I have forgotten. I have been in a far land, across misty voids and gulfs and unlit oceans. What is the year?" Erastus answered him. "It is the waning of the year of the lion, 3,000 years after the fall of Acheron." 3,000 years, murmured the other. "So long. Who are you?" "I am Orestes, once a priest of Mitra. This man is Amalric, baron of Tor in Nemedia. This other is Tarascus, younger brother of the king of Nemedia. And this tall man is Valerius, rightful heir of the throne of Aquilonia." "Why have you given me life?" demanded Zaltotun. "What do you require of me?" The man was now fully alive and awake, his keen eyes reflecting the working of an unclouded brain. There was no hesitation or uncertainty in his manner. He came directly to the point, as one who knows that no man gives something for nothing. Erastus met him with equal candor. "We have opened the doors of hell this night to free your soul and return it to your body, because we need your aid. We wish to place Tarascus on the throne of Nemedia, and to win for Valerius the crown of Aquilonia. With your necromancy, you can aid us." Zaltoten's mind was devious and full of unexpected slants. "You must be deep in the arts yourself, Orestes, to have been able to restore my life. How is it that a priest of Mitra knows of the heart of Ahriman and the incantation of Skelos?" "I am no longer a priest of Mitra," answered Orestes. "I was cast forth from my order because of my delving in black magic. But for Amalric there, I might have been burned as a magician. But that left me free to pursue my studies. I journeyed in Zamora, in Vendia, in Stygia, and among the haunted jungles of Kitai. I read the iron-bound books of Skelos and talked with unseen creatures in deep wells and faceless shapes in black, reeking jungles. I obtained a glimpse of your sarcophagus in the demon-haunted crypts below the black, giant-walled temple of Set in the hinterlands of Stygia, and I learned of the arts that would bring back life to your shriveled corpse. From moldering manuscripts I learned of the heart of Ahriman. Then, for a year, I sought its hiding place, and at last I found it." "Then why trouble to bring me back to life?" demanded Zaltoten, with his piercing gaze fixed on the priest. "Why did you not employ the heart to further your own power?" "Because no man today knows the secrets of the heart," answered Orestes. "Not even in legends live the arts by which to loose its full powers. I knew it could restore life. Of its deeper secrets I am ignorant. I merely used it to bring you back to life. It is the use of your knowledge we seek. As for the heart, you alone know its awful secrets." Zaltoten shook his head, staring broodingly into the flaming depths. "My necromantic knowledge is greater than the sum of all the knowledge of other men," he said. "Yet I do not know the full power of the jewel. I did not invoke it in the old days. I guarded it lest it be used against me. At last it was stolen, and in the hands of a feathered shaman of the barbarians, it defeated all my mighty sorcery. Then it vanished, and I was poisoned by the jealous priests of Stygia before I could learn where it was hidden." "It was hidden in a cavern below the temple of Mitra in Tarantia," said Orestes. "By devious ways I discovered this after I had located your remains in Set's subterranean temple in Stygia. Zamorian thieves, partly protected by spells I learned from sources better left unmentioned, stole your mummy case from under the very talons of those which guarded it in the dark, and by camel caravan and galley and ox wagon, it came at last to this city. Those same thieves, or rather those of them who still lived after their frightful quest, stole the heart of Ahriman from its haunted cavern below the temple of Mitra, and all the skill of men and the spells of sorcerers nearly failed. One man of them lived long enough to reach me and give the jewel into my hands before he died slavering and gibbering of what he had seen in that accursed crypt. The thieves of Zamora are the most faithful of men to their trust. Even with my conjurements, none but they could have stolen the heart from where it has lain in demon-guarded darkness since the fall of Acheron 3,000 years ago." Zaltoten lifted his lion-like head and stared far off into space, as if plumbing the lost centuries. 3,000 years, he muttered. "Set, tell me what has changed in the world." "The barbarians who overthrew Acheron set up new kingdoms," quoth Orestes. "Where the empire had stretched, now rose realms called Aquilonia and Nemedia and Argos from the tribes that founded them. The older kingdoms of Ophir, Corinthia, and Western Koth, which had been subject to the kings of Acheron, regained their independence with the fall of the empire." "And what of the people of Acheron?" demanded Orestes. "When I fled into Stygia, Python was in ruins, and all the great purple-towered cities of Acheron fouled with blood and trampled by the sandals of the barbarians. In the hills, small groups of folk still boast descent from Acheron," answered Orestes. "For the rest, the tide of my barbarian ancestors rolled over them and wiped them out. They, my ancestors, had suffered much from the kings of Acheron." A grim and terrible smile curled the Pythonian's lips. "Aye, many a barbarian, both man and woman, died screaming on the altar under this hand. I have seen their heads piled to make a pyramid in the great square in Python when the kings returned from the west with their spoils and naked captives. Aye, and when the day of reckoning came, the sword was not spared, so Acheron ceased to be, and purple-towered Python became a memory of forgotten days. But the younger kingdoms rose on the imperial ruins and waxed great. And now we have brought you back to aid us to rule these kingdoms, which, if less strange and wonderful than Acheron of old, are yet rich and powerful, well worth fighting for. Look!" Orastus unrolled before the stranger a map drawn cunningly on vellum. Zaltoten regarded it and then shook his head, baffled. "The very outlines of the land are changed. It is like some familiar thing seen in a dream, fantastically distorted." "Howbeit," answered Orastus, tracing with his forefinger, "here is Belveris, the capital of Nemedia, in which we now are. Here run the boundaries of the land of Nemedia. To the south and southeast are Ophir and Corinthia. To the east, Brythunia. To the west, Aquilonia." "It is a map of a world I do not know," said Zaltoten softly. But Orastus did not miss the lurid fire of hate that flickered in his dark eyes. "It is a map you shall help us change," answered Orastus. "It is our desire first to set Tarascus on the throne of Nemedia. We wish to accomplish this without strife, and in such a way that no suspicion will rest on Tarascus. We do not wish the land to be torn by civil wars, but to reserve all our power for the conquest of Aquilonia. Should King Nemed and his sons die naturally, in a plague, for instance, Tarascus would mount the throne as the next heir, peacefully and unopposed." Zaltoten nodded without replying, and Orastus continued, "The other task will be more difficult. We cannot set Valerius on the Aquilonian throne without a war, and that kingdom is a formidable foe. Its people are a hardy, warlike race, toughened by continual wars with the Picts, Zingarians, and Cimmerians. For 500 years, Aquilonia and Nemedia have intermittently waged war, and the ultimate advantage has always lain with the Aquilonians. Their present king is the most renowned warrior among the Western nations. He is an outlander, an adventurer who seized the crown by force during a time of civil strife, strangling King Numedides with his own hands upon the very throne. His name is Conan, and no man can stand before him in battle. Valerius is now the rightful heir of the throne. He had been driven into exile by his royal kinsman Numedides, and has been away from his native realm for years. But he is of the blood of the old dynasty, and many of the barons would secretly hail the overthrow of Conan, who is a nobody, without royal or even noble blood. But the common people are loyal to him, and the nobility of the outlying provinces. Yet if his forces were overthrown in the battle that must first take place, and Conan himself slain, I think it would not be difficult to put Valerius on the throne. Indeed, with Conan slain, the only center of the government would be gone. He is not part of a dynasty, but only a lone adventurer." "I wish that I might see this king," mused Zaltoten, glancing toward a silvery mirror which formed one of the panels of the wall. This mirror cast no reflection, but Zaltoten's expression showed that he understood its purpose, and Orastus nodded with the pride a good craftsman takes in the recognition of his accomplishments by a master of his craft. "I will try to show him to you," he said, and seating himself before the mirror, he gazed hypnotically into its depths, where presently a dim shadow began to take shape. It was uncanny, but those watching knew it was no more than the reflected image of Orastes' thought, embodied in that mirror as a wizard's thoughts are embodied in a magic crystal. It floated hazily, then leaped into startling clarity. A tall man, mightily shouldered and deep of chest, with a massive corded neck and heavily muscled limbs. He was clad in silk and velvet, with the royal lions of Aquilonia worked in gold upon his rich jupon, and the crown of Aquilonia shone on his square-cut black mane. But the great sword at his side seemed more natural to him than the regal accoutrements. His brow was low and broad, his eyes a volcanic blue that smoldered as if with some inner fire. His dark, scarred, almost sinister face was that of a fighting man, and his velvet garments could not conceal the hard, dangerous lines of his limbs. "That man is no Hyborian," exclaimed Zaltoten. "No, he is a Cimmerian, one of those wild tribesmen who dwell in the gray hills of the north." "I fought his ancestors of old," muttered Zaltoten. "Not even the kings of Acheron could conquer them." "They still remain a terror to the nations of the south," answered Orastus. "He is a true son of that savage race, and has proved himself thus far unconquerable." Zaltoten did not reply. He sat staring down at the pool of living fire that shimmered in his hand. Outside, the hound howled again, long and shudderingly. 2. A black wind blows. The year of the dragon had birth in war and pestilence and unrest. The Black Plague stalked through the streets of Belveris, striking down the merchant in his stall, the serf in his kennel, the knight at his banquet board. Before it, the arts of the leeches were helpless. Men said it had been sent from hell as punishment for the sins of pride and lust. It was swift and deadly as the stroke of an adder. The victim's body turned purple and then black, and within a few minutes he sank down dying, and the stench of his own putrefaction was in his nostrils even before death wrenched his soul from his rotting body. A hot, roaring wind blew incessantly from the south, and the crops withered in the fields, the cattle sank and died in their tracks. Men cried out on Mitra and muttered against the king, for somehow throughout the kingdom the word was whispered that the king was secretly addicted to loathsome practices and foul debauches in the seclusion of his nighted palace. And then in that palace, death stalked, grinning on feet about which swirled the monstrous vapors of the plague. In one night the king died with his 3 sons, and the drums that thundered their dirge drowned the grim and ominous bells that rang from the carts that lumbered through the streets, gathering up the rotting dead. That night, just before dawn, the hot wind that had blown for weeks ceased to rustle evilly through the silken window curtains. Out of the north rose a great wind that roared among the towers, and there was cataclysmic thunder and blinding sheets of lightning and driving rain. But the dawn shone clean and green and clear. The scorched ground veiled itself in grass. The thirsty crops sprang up anew, and the plague was gone, its miasma swept clean out of the land by the mighty wind. Men said the gods were satisfied because the evil king and his spawn were slain, and when his young brother Tarascus was crowned in the great coronation hall, the populace cheered until the towers rocked, acclaiming the monarch on whom the gods smiled. Such a wave of enthusiasm and rejoicing as swept the land is frequently the signal for a war of conquest. So no one was surprised when it was announced that King Tarascus had declared the truce made by the late king with their western neighbors void, and was gathering his hosts to invade Aquilonia. His reason was candid, his motives loudly proclaimed, gilded his actions with something of the glamour of a crusade. He espoused the cause of Valerius, rightful heir to the throne. He came, he proclaimed, not as an enemy of Aquilonia, but as a friend, to free the people from the tyranny of a usurper and a foreigner. If there were cynical smiles in certain quarters, and whispers concerning the king's good friend Amalric, whose vast personal wealth seemed to be flowing into the rather depleted royal treasury, they were unheeded in the general wave of fervor and zeal of Tarascus's popularity. If any shrewd individual suspected that Amalric was the real ruler of Nemedia behind the scenes, they were careful not to voice such heresy, and the war went forward with enthusiasm. The king and his allies moved westward at the head of 50,000 men, knights in shining armor with their pennons streaming above their helmets, pikemen in steel caps, and brigandines, crossbowmen in leather jerkins. They crossed the border, took a frontier castle, and burned 3 mountain villages, and then, in the valley of the Valkia, 10 miles west of the boundary line, they met the hosts of Conan, king of Aquilonia, 45,000 knights, archers, and men-at-arms, the flower of Aquilonian strength and chivalry. Only the knights of Poeton under Prospero had not yet arrived, for they had far to ride up from the southwestern corner of the kingdom. Tarascus had struck without warning. His invasion had come on the heels of his proclamation without formal declaration of war. The two hosts confronted each other across a wide, shallow valley with rugged cliffs and a shallow stream winding through masses of reeds and willows down the middle of the vale. The camp followers of both hosts came down to this stream for water and shouted insults and hurled stones across at one another. The last glints of the sun shone on the golden banner of Nemedia with the scarlet dragon, unfurled in the breeze above the pavilion of King Tarascus on an eminence near the eastern cliffs. But the shadow of the western cliffs fell like a vast purple pall across the tents and the army of Aquilonia, and upon the black banner with its golden lion that floated above King Conan's pavilion. All night the fires flared the length of the valley, and the wind brought the call of trumpets, the clangor of arms, and the sharp challenges of the sentries who paced their horses along either edge of the willow-ground stream. It was in the darkness before dawn that King Conan stood on his couch, which was no more than a pile of silks and furs thrown on a dais, and awakened. He started up, crying out sharply and clutching at his sword. Palantides, his commander, rushing in at the cry, saw his king sitting upright, his hand on his hilt, and perspiration dripping from his strangely pale face. "Your Majesty," exclaimed Palantides, "is aught amiss?" "What of the camp?" demanded Conan. "Are the guards out?" 500 horsemen patrol the stream, Your Majesty," answered the general. "The Nemedians have not offered to move against us in the night. They wait for dawn, even as we." "By Crom," muttered Conan, "I awoke with a feeling that doom was creeping on me in the night." He stared up at the great golden lamp, which shed a soft glow over the velvet hangings and carpets of the great tent. They were alone. Not even a slave or a page slept on the carpeted floor. But Conan's eyes blazed as they were wont to blaze in the teeth of great peril, and the sword quivered in his hand. Palantides watched him uneasily. Conan seemed to be listening. "Listen," hissed the king. "Did you hear it? A furtive step." 7 knights guard your tent, Your Majesty," said Palantides. "None could approach it unchallenged." "Not outside," growled Conan. "It seemed to sound inside the tent." Palantides cast a swift, startled look around. The velvet hangings merged with shadows in the corners, but if there had been anyone in the pavilion besides themselves, the general would have seen him. Again he shook his head. "There is no one here, sire. You sleep in the midst of your host." "I have seen death strike a king in the midst of thousands," muttered Conan. "Something that walks on invisible feet and is not seen." "Perhaps you were dreaming, Your Majesty," said Palantides, somewhat perturbed. "So I was," grunted Conan. "A devilish, strange dream it was, too. I trod again all the long, weary roads I traveled on my way to the kingship." He fell silent, and Palantides stared at him, unspeaking. The king was an enigma to the general, as to most of his civilized subjects. Palantides knew that Conan had walked many strange roads in his wild, eventful life, and had been many things before a twist of fate set him on the throne of Aquilonia. "I saw again the battlefield whereon I was born," said Conan, resting his chin moodily on a massive fist. "I saw myself in a panther-skin loincloth, throwing my spear at the mountain beasts. I was a mercenary swordsman again, a hetman of the Kozaki who dwell along the Zaporozhka River, a corsair looting the coast of Kush, a pirate of the Barakan Isles, a chief of the Himalayan hillmen. All these things I've been, and of all these things I dreamed. All the shapes that have been, I passed like an endless procession, and their feet beat out a dirge in the sounding dust. But throughout my dreams moved strange veiled figures and ghostly shadows, and a faraway voice mocked me. And toward the last I seemed to see myself lying on this dais in my tent, and a shape bent over me, robed and hooded. I lay unable to move, and then the hood fell away, and a moldering skull grinned down at me. Then it was that I awoke." "This is an evil dream, Your Majesty," said Palantides, suppressing a shudder, "but no more." Conan shook his head, more in doubt than in denial. He came of a barbaric race, and the superstitions and instincts of his heritage lurked close beneath the surface of his consciousness. "I've dreamed many evil dreams," he said, "and most of them were meaningless. But by Crom, this was not like most dreams. I wish this battle were fought and won, for I've had a grisly premonition ever since King Nimed died in the Black Plague. Why did it cease when he died?" "Men say he sinned." "Men are fools, as always," grunted Conan. "If the plague struck all who sinned, then by Crom, there wouldn't be enough left to count the living. Why should the gods, who the priests tell me are just, slay 500 peasants and merchants and nobles before they slew the king, if the whole pestilence were aimed at him? What are gods smiting blindly like swordsmen in a fog? By Mitra, if I aimed my strokes no straighter, Aquilonia would have had a new king long ago. No, the Black Plague's no common pestilence. It lurks in Stygian tombs, and is called forth into being only by wizards. I was a swordsman in Prince Almoric's army that invaded Stygia, and of his 30,000, 15,000 perished by Stygian arrows, and the rest by the Black Plague that rolled on us like a wind out of the south. I was the only man who lived. Yet only 500 died in Nemedia, argued Palantides. Whoever called it into being knew how to cut it short at will, answered Conan. So I know there was something planned and diabolical about it. Someone called it forth, someone banished it when the work was completed, when Tarascus was safe on the throne and being hailed as the deliverer of the people from the wrath of the gods. By Crom, I sense a black, subtle brain behind all this. What of this stranger who men say gives counsel to Tarascus? He wears a veil, answered Palantides. They say he is a foreigner, a stranger from Stygia. A stranger from Stygia, repeated Conan, scowling. A stranger from hell, more like. Ha! What is that? The trumpets of the Nemedians, exclaimed Palantides. And hark, how our own blare upon their heels. Dawn is breaking, and the captains are marshalling the hosts for the onset. Mitra be with them, for many will not see the sun go down behind the crags. Send my squires to me, exclaimed Conan, rising with alacrity and casting off his velvet night garment. He seemed to have forgotten his forebodings at the prospect of action. Go to the captains and see that all is in readiness. I will be with you as soon as I don my armor. Many of Conan's ways were inexplicable to the civilized people he ruled, and one of them was his insistence on sleeping alone in his chamber or tent. Palantides hastened from the pavilion, clanking in the armor he had donned at midnight after a few hours' sleep. He cast a swift glance over the camp, which was beginning to swarm with activity, mail clinking and men moving about dimly in the uncertain light among the long lines of tents. Stars still glimmered palely in the western sky, but long pink streamers stretched along the eastern horizon, and against them the dragon banner of Nemedia flung out its billowing silken folds. Palantides turned toward a smaller tent nearby, where slept the royal squires. These were tumbling out already, roused by the trumpets, and as Palantides called to them to hasten, he was frozen speechless by a deep, fierce shout and the impact of a heavy blow inside the king's tent, followed by the heart-stopping crash of a falling body. There sounded a low laugh that turned the general's blood to ice. Echoing the cry, Palantides wheeled and rushed back into the pavilion. He cried out again as he saw Conan's powerful frame stretched out on the carpet. The king's great two-handed sword lay near his hand, and a shattered tent pole seemed to show where his stroke had fallen. Palantides' sword was out, and he glared about the tent, but nothing met his gaze. Save for the king and himself, it was empty, as it had been when he left it. Your Majesty! Palantides threw himself on his knee beside the fallen giant. Conan's eyes were open. They blazed up at him with full intelligence and recognition. His lips writhed, but no sound came forth. He seemed unable to move. Voices sounded without. Palantides rose swiftly and stepped to the door. The royal squires and one of the knights who guarded the tent stood there. We heard a sound within, said the knight apologetically. Is all well with the king? Palantides regarded him searchingly. None has entered or left the pavilion this night? None save yourself, my lord, answered the knight, and Palantides could not doubt his honesty. The king stumbled and dropped his sword, said Palantides briefly. Return to your post. As the knight turned away, the general covertly motioned to the 5 royal squires, and when they had followed him in, he drew the flap closely. They turned pale at sight of the king stretched upon the carpet, but Palantides' quick gesture checked their exclamations. The general bent over him again, and again Conan made an effort to speak. The veins in his temples and the cords in his neck swelled with his efforts, and he lifted his head clear of the ground. Voice came at last, mumbling and half-intelligible. The thing in the corner. Palantides lifted his head and looked fearfully about him. He saw the pale faces of the squires in the lamplight, the velvet shadows that lurked along the walls of the pavilion. That was all. There is nothing here, your majesty, he said. It was there, in the corner, muttered the king, tossing his lion-maned head from side to side in his efforts to rise. A man, at least he looked like a man, wrapped in rags like a mummy's bandages, with a moldering cloak drawn about him and a hood. All I could see was his eyes, as he crouched there in the shadows. I thought he was a shadow himself until I saw his eyes. They were like black jewels. I made at him and swung my sword, But I missed him clean. How? Crom knows. And splintered that pole instead. He caught my wrist as I staggered off balance, and his fingers burned like hot iron. All the strength went out of me, and the floor rose and struck me like a club. Then he was gone, and I was down, and, curse him, I can't move. I'm paralyzed. Palantides lifted the giant's hand, and his flesh crawled. On the king's wrist showed the blue marks of long, lean fingers. What hand could grip so hard as to leave its print on that thick wrist? Palantides remembered that low laugh he had heard as he rushed into the tent, and cold perspiration beaded his skin. It had not been Conan who laughed. "This is a thing diabolical," whispered a trembling squire. "Men say the children of darkness war for Tarascus." "Be silent," ordered Palantides sternly. Outside, the dawn was dimming the stars. A light wind sprang up from the peaks and brought the fanfare of 1,000 trumpets. At the sound, a convulsive shudder ran through the king's mighty form. Again the veins in his temples knotted as he strove to break the invisible shackles which crushed him down. "Put my harness on me and tie me into my saddle," he whispered. "I'll lead the charge yet." Palantides shook his head, and a squire plucked his skirt. "My lord, we are lost if the host learns the king has been smitten. Only he could have led us to victory this day." "Help me lift him on the dais," answered the general. They obeyed, and laid the helpless giant on the furs and spread a silken cloak over him. Palantides turned to the 5 squires and searched their pale faces long before he spoke. "Our lips must be sealed forever as to what happens in this tent," he said at last. "The kingdom of Aquilonia depends upon it. One of you go and fetch me the officer Volanus, who is a captain of the Pelian spearmen." The squire indicated bowed and hastened from the tent, and Palantides stood staring down at the stricken king, while outside trumpets blared, drums thundered, and the roar of the multitudes rose in the growing dawn. Presently the squire returned with the officer Palantides had named, a tall man, broad and powerful, built much like the king. Like him also, he had thick black hair, but his eyes were gray, and he did not resemble Conan in his features. "The king is stricken by a strange malady," said Palantides briefly. "A great honor is yours. You are to wear his armor and ride at the head of the host today. None must know that it is not the king who rides." "It is an honor for which a man might gladly give up his life," stammered the captain, overcome by the suggestion. "Mitra grant that I do not fail of this mighty trust." And while the fallen king stared with burning eyes that reflected the bitter rage and humiliation that ate his heart, the squire stripped Volanus of mail shirt, burgonet, and leg pieces, and clad him in Conan's armor of black plate mail, with a visored salade and the dark plumes nodding over the wyvern crest. Over all they put the silken surcoat, with a royal lion worked in gold upon the breast, and they girt him with a broad gold-buckled belt which supported a jewel-hilted broadsword in a cloth of gold scabbard. While they worked, trumpets clamored outside, arms clanged, and across the river rose a deep-throated roar as squadron after squadron swung into place. Full armed, Volanus dropped to his knee and bent his plumes before the figure that lay on the dais. "Lord King, Mitra grant that I do not dishonor the harness I wear this day. Bring me Tarascus's head, and I'll make you a baron." In the stress of his anguish, Conan's veneer of civilization had fallen from him. His eyes flamed. He ground his teeth in fury and bloodlust, as barbaric as any tribesman in the Cimmerian hills. 3. The Cliffs Reel. The Aquilonian host was drawn up, long serried lines of pikemen and horsemen in gleaming steel, when a giant figure in black armor emerged from the royal pavilion, and as he swung up into the saddle of the black stallion held by 4 squires, a roar that shook the mountains went up from the host. They shook their blades and thundered forth their acclaim of their warrior king. Knights in gold-chased armor, pikemen in mail-coats and bassinets, archers in their leather jerkins with their long bows in their left hands. The host on the opposite side of the valley was in motion, trotting down the long, gentle slope toward the river. Their steels shone through the mists of morning that swirled about their horses' feet. The Aquilonian host moved leisurely to meet them. The measured tramp of the armored horses made the ground tremble. Banners flung out long silken folds in the morning wind. Lances swayed like a bristling forest, dipped and sank, their pennons fluttering about them. 10 men-at-arms, grim, taciturn veterans who could hold their tongues, guarded the royal pavilion. One squire stood in the tent, peering out through a slit in the doorway. But for the handful in the secret, no one else in the vast host knew that it was not Conan who rode on the great stallion at the head of the army. The Aquilonian host had assumed the customary formation. The strongest part was the center, composed entirely of heavily armed knights. The wings were made up of smaller bodies of horsemen, mounted men-at-arms, mostly, supported by pikemen and archers. The latter were Bosonians from the western marches, strongly built men of medium stature, in leathern jackets and iron headpieces. The Nemedian army came on in similar formation, and the two hosts moved toward the river, the wings in advance of the centers. In the center of the Aquilonian host, the great lion banner streamed its billowing black folds over the steel-clad figure on the black stallion. But on his dais in the royal pavilion, Conan groaned in anguish of spirit and cursed with strange heathen oaths. The hosts moved together, quoth the squire, watching from the door. Hear the trumpets peal. Ha! The rising sun strikes fire from lance heads and helmets until I am dazzled. It turns the river crimson. Aye, it will be truly crimson before this day is done. The foe have reached the river. Now arrows fly between the hosts like stinging clouds that hide the sun. Ha! Well loosed, bowmen! The Bosonians have the better of it. Hark to them shout! Faintly in the ears of the king, above the din of trumpets and clanging steel, came the deep, fierce shout of the Bosonians as they drew and loosed in perfect unison. Their archers seek to hold ours in play while their knights ride into the river, said the squire. The banks are not steep. They slope to the water's edge. The knights come on. They crash through the willows. By Mitra, the cloth-yard shafts find every crevice of their harness. Horses and men go down, struggling and thrashing in the water. It is not deep, nor is the current swift, but men are drowning there, dragged under by their armor and trampled by the frantic horses. Now the knights of Aquilonia advance. They ride into the water and engage the knights of Nemedia. The water swirls about their horses' bellies, and the clang of sword against sword is deafening. Crum! Burst in agony from Conan's lips. Life was coursing sluggishly back into his veins, but still he could not lift his mighty frame from the dais. The wings close in, said the squire. Pikemen and swordsmen fight hand to hand in the stream, and behind them the bowmen ply their shafts. By Mitra, the Nemedian arbalesters are sorely harried, and the Bosonians arch their arrows to drop amid the rear ranks. Their center gains not a foot, and their wings are pushed back up from the stream again. Crum! Ymir and Mitra, raged Conan. Gods and devils, could I but reach the fighting, if but to die at the first blow. Outside, through the long, hot day, the battle stormed and thundered. The valley shook to charge and countercharge to the whistling of shafts and the crash of rending shields and splintering lances. But the hosts of Aquilonia held fast. Once they were forced back from the bank, but a countercharge with a black banner flowing over the black stallion regained the lost ground. And like an iron rampart they held the right bank of the stream, and at last the squire gave Conan the news that the Nemedians were falling back from the river. Their wings are in confusion, he cried. Their knights reel back from the swordplay. But what is this? Your banner is in motion. The center sweeps into the stream. By Mitra, Valanis is leading the host across the river. Fool, groaned Conan. It may be a trick. He should hold his position. By dawn, Prospero will be here with the Poitanian levies. The knights ride into a hail of arrows, cried the squire, but they do not falter. They sweep on, they have crossed. They charge up the slope. Palantides has hurled the wings across the river to their support. It is all he can do. The lion banner dips and staggers above the melee. The knights of Nemedia make a stand. They are broken. They fall back. Their left wing is in full flight, and our pikemen cut them down as they run. I see Valanis riding and smiting like a madman. He is carried beyond himself by the fighting lust. Men no longer look to Palantides. They follow Valanis, deeming him Conan as he rides with closed visor. But look! There is method in his madness. He swings wide of the Nemedian front with 5,000 knights, the pick of the army. The main host of the Nemedians is in confusion, and look, their flank is protected by the cliffs. But there is a defile left unguarded. It is like a great cleft in the wall that opens again behind the Nemedian lines. By Mitra, Valanas sees and seizes the opportunity. He has driven their wing before him, and he leads his knights toward that defile. They swing wide of the main battle. They cut through a line of spearmen. They charge into the defile. "An ambush!" cried Conan, striving to struggle upright. "No!" shouted the squire exultantly. "The whole Nemedian host is in full sight. They have forgotten the defile. They never expected to be pushed back that far. Oh, fool, fool, Tarascus, to make such a blunder. Ah, I see lances and pennons pouring from the farther mouth of the defile, beyond the Nemedian lines. They will smite those ranks from the rear and crumple them. Mitra, what is this?" He staggered as the walls of the tent swayed drunkenly. Afar, over the thunder of the fight, rose a deep, bellowing roar, indescribably ominous. "The cliffs reel!" shrieked the squire. "Oh, gods, what is this? The river foams out of its channel, and the peaks are crumbling. The ground shakes, and horses and riders in armor are overthrown. The cliffs are falling!" With his words came a grinding rumble and a thunderous concussion, and the ground trembled. Over the roar of the battle sounded screams of mad terror. "The cliffs have crumbled!" cried the livid squire. "They have thundered down into the defile and crushed every living creature in it. I saw the lion banner wave an instant amid the dust and falling stones, and then it vanished. Ha! The Nemedians shout with triumph. Well may they shout, for the fall of the cliffs has wiped out 5,000 of our bravest knights. Hark!" To Conan's ears came a vast torrent of sound, rising and rising in frenzy. "The king is dead! The king is dead! Flee! Flee! The king is dead!" "Liars!" panted Conan. "Dogs! Knaves! Cowards! Oh, cram, if I could but stand! But crawl to the river with my sword in my teeth! How, boy? Do they flee?" "Aye," sobbed the squire. "They spur for the river. They are broken, hurled on like spume before a storm. I see Palantides striving to stem the torrent. He is down, and the horses trample him. They rush into the river, knights, bowmen, pikemen, all mixed and mingled in one mad torrent of destruction. The Nemedians are on their heels, cutting them down like corn." "But they will make a stand on this side of the river," cried the king. With an effort that brought the sweat dripping from his temples, he heaved himself up on his elbows. "Nay," cried the squire, "they cannot. They are broken, routed. Oh, gods, that I should live to see this day." Then he remembered his duty and shouted to the men-at-arms who stood stolidly watching the flight of their comrades, "Get a horse swiftly and help me lift the king upon it. We dare not bide here." But before they could do his bidding, the first drift of the storm was upon them. Knights and spearmen and archers fled among the tents, stumbling over ropes and baggage, and mingled with them were Nemedian riders who smote right and left at all alien figures. Tent ropes were cut, fire sprang up in 100 places, and the plundering had already begun. The grim guardsmen about Conan's tent died where they stood, smiting and thrusting, and over their mangled corpses beat the hoofs of the conquerors. But the squire had drawn the flap close, and in the confused madness of the slaughter none realized that the pavilion held an occupant. So the flight and the pursuit swept past and roared away up the valley, and the squire looked out presently to see a cluster of men approaching the royal tent with evident purpose. "Here comes the king of Nemedia with 4 companions and his squire," quoth he. "He will accept your surrender, my fair lord." "Surrender the devil's heart," gritted the king. He had forced himself up to a sitting posture. He swung his legs painfully off the dais and staggered upright, reeling drunkenly. The squire ran to assist him, but Conan pushed him away. "Give me that bow," he gritted, indicating a long bow and quiver that hung from a tent pole. "But, your majesty," cried the squire in great perturbation, "the battle is lost. It were the part of majesty to yield with the dignity becoming one of royal blood." "I have no royal blood," ground Conan. "I am a barbarian and the son of a blacksmith." Wrenching away the bow and an arrow, he staggered toward the opening of the pavilion. So formidable was his appearance, naked but for short leather breeks and sleeveless shirt open to reveal his great hairy chest, with his huge limbs and his blue eyes blazing under his tangled black mane, that the squire shrank back, more afraid of his king than of the whole Nemedian host. Reeling on wide-braced legs, Conan drunkenly tore the door flap open and staggered out under the canopy. The king of Numidia and his companions had dismounted, and they halted short, staring in wonder at the apparition confronting them. "Here I am, you jackals!" roared the Cimmerian. "I am the king! Death to you, dog brothers!" He jerked the arrow to his head and loosed, and the shaft feathered itself in the breast of the knight who stood beside Tarascus. Conan hurled the bow at the king of Numidia. "Curse my shaky hand! Come in and take me if you dare!" Reeling backward on unsteady legs, he fell with his shoulders against a tent pole, and, propped upright, he lifted his great sword with both hands. "By Mitra, it is the king!" swore Tarascus. He cast a swift look about him and laughed. "Ha! That other was a jackal in his harness. In, dogs, and take his head!" The 3 soldiers, men-at-arms wearing the emblem of the royal guards, rushed at the king, and one felled the squire with a blow of a mace. The other 2 fared less well. As the first rushed in, lifting his sword, Conan met him with a sweeping stroke that severed mail links like cloth and sheared the Numidian's arm and shoulder clean from his body. His corpse, pitching backward, fell across his companion's legs. The man stumbled, and before he could recover, the great sword was through him. Conan wrenched out his steel with a racking gasp and staggered back against the tent pole. His great limbs trembled, his chest heaved, and sweat poured down his face and neck. But his eyes flamed with exultant savagery, and he panted, "Why do you stand afar off, dog of Belverus? I can't reach you. Come in and die." Tarascus hesitated, glanced at the remaining man-at-arms, and his squire, a gaunt, saturnine man in black mail, and took a step forward. He was far inferior in size and strength to the giant Cimmerian, but he was in full armor, and was famed in all the western nations as a swordsman. But his squire caught his arm. "Nay, your majesty, do not throw away your life. I will summon archers to shoot this barbarian, as we shoot lions." Neither of them had noticed that a chariot had approached while the fight was going on, and now came to a halt before them. But Conan saw, looking over their shoulders, and a queer chill sensation crawled along his spine. There was something vaguely unnatural about the appearance of the black horses that drew the vehicle, but it was the occupant of the chariot that arrested the king's attention. He was a tall man, superbly built, clad in a long, unadorned silk robe. He wore a Shemitish headdress, and its lower folds hid his features, except for the dark, magnetic eyes. The hands that grasped the reins, pulling the rearing horses back on their haunches, were white but strong. Conan glared at the stranger, all his primitive instincts roused. He sensed an aura of menace and power that exuded from this veiled figure, a menace as definite as the windless waving of tall grass that marks the path of the serpent. "Hail, Zoltoten!" exclaimed Tarascus. "Here is the king of Aquilonia. He did not die in the landslide as we thought." "I know," answered the other, without bothering to say how he knew. "What is your present intention?" "I will summon the archers to slay him," answered the Numidian. "As long as he lives, he will be dangerous to us." "Yet even a dog has uses," answered Zoltoten. "Take him alive." Conan laughed raspingly. "Come in and try," he challenged. "But for my treacherous legs, I'd hew you out of that chariot like a woodman hewing a tree. But you'll never take me alive, damn you." "He speaks the truth, I fear," said Tarascus. "The man is a barbarian with the senseless ferocity of a wounded tiger. Let me summon the archers." "Watch me and learn wisdom," advised Zoltoten. His hand dipped into his robe and came out with something shining, a glistening sphere. This he threw suddenly at Conan. The Cimmerian contemptuously struck it aside with his sword. At the instant of contact, there was a sharp explosion, a flare of white, blinding flame, and Conan pitched senseless to the ground. "He is dead." Tarascus's tone was more assertion than inquiry. "No, he is but senseless. He will recover his senses in a few hours. Bid your men bind his arms and legs and lift him into my chariot." With a gesture, Tarascus did so, and they heaved the senseless king into the chariot, grunting with their burden. Zoltoten threw a velvet cloak over his body, completely covering him from any who might peer in. He gathered the reins in his hands. "I'm for Belverus," he said. "Tell Amalric that I will be with him if he needs me. But with Conan out of the way and his army broken, lance and sword should suffice for the rest of the conquest.
Prospero cannot be bringing more than 10,000 men to the field, and will doubtless fall back to Tarantia when he hears the news of the battle. Say nothing to Amalric or Valerius or anyone about our capture. Let them think Conan died in the fall of the cliffs." He looked at the man-at-arms for a long space, until the guardsman moved restlessly, nervous under the scrutiny. "What is that about your waist?" Zoltoten demanded. "Why, my girdle, may it please you, my lord," stuttered the amazed guardsman. "You lie!" Zoltoten's laugh was merciless as a sword edge. "It is a poisonous serpent. What a fool you are to wear a reptile about your waist." With distended eyes, the man looked down, and to his utter horror, he saw the buckle of his girdle rear up at him. It was a snake's head. He saw the evil eyes and the dripping fangs, heard the hiss, and felt the loathsome contact of the thing about his body. He screamed hideously and struck at it with his naked hand, felt its fangs flesh themselves in that hand, and then he stiffened and fell heavily. Tarascus looked down at him without expression. He saw only the leathern girdle and the buckle, the pointed tongue of which was stuck in the guardsman's palm. Zoltoten turned his hypnotic gaze on Tarascus' squire, and the man turned ashen and began to tremble. But the king interposed. "Nay, we can trust him." The sorcerer tautened the reins and swung the horses around. "See that this piece of work remains secret. If I am needed, let Altaro, Orastus' servant, summon me as I have taught him. I will be in your palace at Belverus." Tarascus lifted his hand in salutation, but his expression was not pleasant to see as he looked after the departing mesmerist. "Why should he spare the Cimmerian?" whispered the frightened squire. "That I am wondering myself," grunted Tarascus. Behind the rumbling chariot, the dull roar of battle and pursuit faded in the distance. The setting sun rimmed the cliffs with scarlet flame, and the chariot moved into the vast blue shadows floating up out of the east. 4. From what hell have you crawled? Of that long ride in the chariot of Zoltoten, Conan knew nothing. He lay like a dead man while the bronze wheels clashed over the stones of mountain roads and swished through the deep grass of fertile valleys, and finally, dropping down from the rugged heights, rumbled rhythmically along the broad white road that winds through the rich meadowlands to the walls of Belverus. Just before dawn, some faint reviving of life touched him. He heard a mumble of voices, the groan of ponderous hinges. Through a slit in the cloak that covered him, he saw faintly in the lurid glare of torches the great black arch of a gateway and the bearded faces of men-at-arms, the torches striking fire from their spearheads and helmets. "How went the battle, my fair lord?" spoke an eager voice in the Nemedian tongue. "Well, indeed," was the curt reply. "The king of Aquilonia lies slain, and his host is broken." A babble of excited voices rose, drowned the next instant by the whirling wheels of the chariot on the flags. Sparks flashed from under the revolving rims as Zoltoten lashed his steeds through the arch. But Conan heard one of the guardsmen mutter, "From beyond the border to Belverus, between sunset and dawn, and the horses scarcely sweating, by Mitra they—" Then silence drank the voices, and there was only the clatter of hoofs and wheels along the shadowy street. What he had heard registered itself on Conan's brain, but suggested nothing to him. He was like a mindless automaton that hears and sees but does not understand. Sights and sounds flowed meaninglessly about him. He lapsed again into a deep lethargy, and was only dimly aware when the chariot halted in a deep, high-walled court, and he was lifted from it by many hands and borne up a winding stone stair and down a long, dim corridor. Whispers, stealthy footsteps, unrelated sounds surged or rustled about him, irrelevant and far away. Yet his ultimate awakening was abrupt and crystal clear. He possessed full knowledge of the battle in the mountains and its consequences, and he had a good idea of where he was. He lay on a velvet couch, clad as he was the day before, but with his limbs loaded with chains not even he could break. The room in which he lay was furnished with somber magnificence, the walls covered with black velvet tapestries, the floor with heavy purple carpets. There was no sign of door or window, and one curiously carven gold lamp swinging from the fretted ceiling shed a lurid light over all. In that light, the figure seated in a silver throne-like chair before him seemed unreal and fantastic, with an elusiveness of outline that was heightened by a filmy silken robe. But the features were distinct, Unnaturally so in that uncertain light. It was almost as if a weird nimbus played about the man's head, casting the bearded face into bold relief, so that it was the only definite and distinct reality in that mystic, ghostly chamber. It was a magnificent face with strongly chiseled features of classical beauty. There was indeed something disquieting about the calm tranquility of its aspect, a suggestion of more than human knowledge, of a profound certitude beyond human assurance. Also, an uneasy sensation of familiarity twitched at the back of Conan's consciousness. He had never seen this man's face before, he well knew, yet those features reminded him of something or someone. It was like encountering in the flesh some dream image that had haunted one in nightmares. "Who are you?" demanded the king belligerently, struggling to a sitting position in spite of his chains. "Men call me Zoltoten," was the reply in a strong, golden voice. "What place is this?" the Cimmerian next demanded. "A chamber in the palace of King Tarascus in Belverus." Conan was not surprised. Belverus, the capital, was at the same time the largest Nemedian city, so near the border. "And where's Tarascus?" "With the army." "Well," growled Conan, "if you mean to murder me, why don't you do it and get it over with?" "I did not save you from the king's archers to murder you in Belverus," answered Zoltoten. "What the devil did you do to me?" demanded Conan. "I blasted your consciousness," answered Zoltoten. "How? You would not understand. Call it black magic, if you will." Conan had already reached that conclusion and was mulling over something else. "I think I understand why you spared my life," he rumbled. "Almaric wants to keep me as a check on Valerius in case the impossible happens and he becomes king of Aquilonia. It's well known that the Baron of Tor is behind this move to seat Valerius on my throne, and if I know Amalric, he doesn't intend that Valerius shall be anything more than a figurehead, as Tarascus is now." "Amalric knows nothing of your capture," answered Zoltoten. "Neither does Valerius. Both think you died at Valgia." Conan's eyes narrowed as he stared at the man in silence. "I sensed a brain behind all this," he muttered, "but I thought it was Amalric's. Are Amalric, Tarascus, and Valerius all but puppets dancing on your string? Who are you?" "What does it matter? If I told you, you would not believe me. What if I told you I might set you back on the throne of Aquilonia?" Conan's eyes burned on him like a wolf. "What's your price?" "Obedience to me." "Go to hell with your offer," snarled Conan. "I'm no figurehead. I won my crown with my sword. Besides, it's beyond your power to buy and sell the throne of Aquilonia at your will. The kingdom's not conquered. One battle doesn't decide a war." "You war against more than swords," answered Zoltoten. "Was it a mortal sword that felled you in your tent before the fight? Nay, it was a child of the dark, a waif of outer space, whose fingers were afire with the frozen coldness of the black gulfs, which froze the blood in your veins and the marrow of your thews. Coldness so cold that it burned your flesh like white-hot iron. Was it chance that led the man who wore your harness to lead his knights into the defile? Chance that brought the cliffs crashing down upon them?" Conan glared at him, unspeaking, feeling a chill along his spine. Wizards and sorcerers abounded in his barbaric mythology, and any fool could tell that this was no common man. Conan sensed an inexplicable something about him that set him apart, an alien aura of time and space, a sense of tremendous and sinister antiquity. But his stubborn spirit refused to flinch. "The fall of the cliffs was chance," he muttered truculently. "The charge into the defile was what any man would have done." "Not so. You would not have led a charge into it. You would have suspected a trap. You would never have crossed the river in the first place until you were sure the Nemedian route was real. Hypnotic suggestions would not have invaded your mind, even in the madness of battle, to make you mad and rush blindly into the trap laid for you, as it did the lesser man who masqueraded as you." Then, if this was all planned, Conan grunted skeptically, all a plot to trap my host, why did not the Child of Darkness kill me in my tent? Because I wished to take you alive. It took no wizardry to predict that Philontides would send another man out in your harness. I wanted you alive and unhurt. You may fit into my scheme of things. There is a vital power about you, greater than the craft and cunning of my allies. You are a bad enemy, but might make a fine vassal. Conan spat savagely at the word, and Zoltoten, ignoring his fury, took a crystal globe from a nearby table and placed it before him. He did not support it in any way, nor place it on anything, but it hung motionless in midair, as solidly as if it rested on an iron pedestal. Conan snorted at this bit of necromancy, but he was nevertheless impressed. "Would you know of what goes on in Aquilonia?" he asked. Conan did not reply, but the sudden rigidity of his form betrayed his interest. Zoltoten stared into the cloudy depths and spoke. "It is now the evening of the day after the Battle of Valkia. Last night, the main body of the army camped by Valkia, while squadrons of knights harried the fleeing Aquilonians. At dawn, the host broke camp and pushed westward through the mountains. Prospero, with 10,000 Poitanians, was miles from the battlefield when he met the fleeing survivors in the early dawn. He had pushed on all night, hoping to reach the field before the battle joined. Unable to rally the remnants of the broken host, he fell back toward Tarantia. Riding hard, replacing his wearied horses with steeds seized from the countryside, he approaches Tarantia. I see his weary knights, their armor gray with dust, their pennons drooping as they push their tired horses through the plain. I see also the streets of Tarantia. The city is in turmoil. Somehow word has reached the people of the defeat and the death of King Conan. The mob is mad with fear, crying out that the king is dead, and there is none to lead them against the Nemedians. Giant shadows rush on Aquilonia from the east, and the sky is black with vultures." Conan cursed deeply. "What are these but words? The raggedest beggar in the street might prophesy as much. If you say you saw all that in the glass ball, then you're a liar as well as a knave, of which last there's no doubt. Prospero will hold Tarantia, and the barons will rally to him. Count Trocero of Poitan commands the kingdom in my absence, and he'll drive these Nemedian dogs howling back to their kennels. What are 50,000 Nemedians? Aquilonia will swallow them up. They'll never see Belverus again. It's not Aquilonia which was conquered at Valkia. It was only Conan." "Aquilonia is doomed," answered Zoltoten, unmoved. "Lance and axe and torch shall conquer her, or if they fail, powers from the dark of ages shall march against her. As the cliffs fell at Valkia, so shall walled cities and mountains fall if the need arise, and rivers roar from their channels to drown whole provinces. Better if steel and bowstring prevail without further aid from the arts, for the constant use of mighty spells sometimes sets forces in motion that might rock the universe." "From what hell have you crawled, you knighted dog?" muttered Conan, staring at the man. The Cimmerian involuntarily shivered. He sensed something incredibly ancient, incredibly evil. Zoltoten lifted his head as if listening to whispers across the void. He seemed to have forgotten his prisoner. Then he shook his head impatiently and glanced impersonally at Conan. "What? Why, if I told you, you would not believe me. But I am wearied of conversation with you. It is less fatiguing to destroy a walled city than it is to frame my thoughts in words a brainless barbarian can understand." "If my hands were free," opined Conan, "I'd soon make a brainless corpse out of you." "I do not doubt it, if I were fool enough to give you the opportunity," answered Zoltoten, clapping his hands. His manner had changed. There was impatience in his tone and a certain nervousness in his manner, though Conan did not think this attitude was in any way connected with himself. "Consider what I have told you, barbarian," said Zoltoten. "You will have plenty of leisure. I have not yet decided what I shall do with you. It depends on circumstances yet unborn. But let this be impressed upon you, that if I decide to use you in my game, it will be better to submit without resistance than to suffer my wrath." Conan spat a curse at him just as hangings that masked the door swung apart and 4 giant Negroes entered. Each was clad only in a silken breechclout supported by a girdle from which hung a great key. Zoltoten gestured impatiently toward the king and turned away, as if dismissing the matter entirely from his mind. His fingers twitched queerly. From a carven green jade box he took a handful of shimmering black dust and placed it in a brazier which stood on a golden tripod at his elbow. The crystal globe, which he seemed to have forgotten, fell suddenly to the floor, as if its invisible support had been removed. Then the blacks had lifted Conan, for so loaded with chains was he that he could not walk, and carried him from the chamber. A glance back, before the heavy gold-bound teak door was closed, showed him Zoltoten leaning back in his throne-like chair, his arms folded, while a thin wisp of smoke curled up from the brazier. Conan's scalp prickled. In Stygia, that ancient and evil kingdom that lay far to the south, he had seen such black dust before. It was the pollen of the black lotus, which creates death like sleep and monstrous dreams. And he knew that only the grisly wizards of the Black Ring, which is the nadir of evil, voluntarily seek the scarlet nightmares of the Black Lotus to revive their necromantic powers. The Black Ring was a fable and a lie to most folk of the Western world, but Conan knew of its ghastly reality and its grim votaries who practiced their abominable sorceries amid the black vaults of Stygia and the nighted domes of accursed Sabbatia. He glanced back at the cryptic gold-bound door, shuddering at what it hid. Whether it was day or night, the king could not tell. The palace of King Tarasca seemed a shadowy, nighted place that shunned natural illumination. The spirit of darkness and shadow hovered over it, and that spirit, Conan felt, was embodied in the stranger Zoltoten. The Negroes carried the king along a winding corridor so dimly lighted that they moved through it like black ghosts bearing a dead man, and down a stone stair that wound endlessly. A torch in the hand of one cast the great deformed shadows streaming along the wall. It was like the descent into hell of a corpse borne by dusky demons. At last they reached the foot of the stair, and then they traversed a long, straight corridor with a blank wall on one hand, pierced by an occasional arched doorway with a stair leading up behind it, and on the other hand, another wall showing heavy barred doors at regular intervals of a few feet. Halting before one of these doors, one of the blacks produced the key that hung at his girdle and turned it in the lock. Then, pushing open the grill, they entered with their captive. They were in a small dungeon with heavy stone walls, floor, and ceiling, and in the opposite wall there was another grilled door. What lay beyond that door Conan could not tell, but he did not believe it was another corridor. The glimmering light of the torch flickering through the bars hinted at shadowy spaciousness and echoing depths. In one corner of the dungeon, near the door through which they had entered, a cluster of rusty chains hung from a great iron ring set in the stone. In these chains a skeleton dangled. Conan glared at it with some curiosity, noticing the state of the bare bones, most of which was splintered and broken. The skull, which had fallen from the vertebrae, was crushed as if by some savage blow of tremendous force. Stolidly, one of the blacks, not the one who had opened the door, removed the chains from the ring, using his key on the massive lock, and dragged the mass of rusty metal and shattered bones over to one side. Then they fastened Conan's chains to that ring, and the third black turned his key in the lock of the farther door, grunting when he had assured himself that it was properly fastened. Then they regarded Conan cryptically, slit-eyed ebony giants, the torch striking highlights from their glossy skin. He who held the key to the nearer door was moved to remark gutturally, "This is your palace now, White Dog King. None but master and we know. All palace sleep. We keep secret. You live and die here, maybe, like him." He contemptuously kicked the shattered skull and sent it clattering across the stone floor. End of Side 1. To continue, turn the cassette over. Side 2. Conan the Conqueror, continuing on page 46. Conan did not deign to reply to the taunt, and the black, galled perhaps by his prisoner's silence, muttered a curse, stooped,
and spat full in the king's face. It was an unfortunate move for the black. Conan was seated on the floor, the chains about his waist, ankles and wrists locked to the ring in the wall. He could neither rise nor move more than a yard out from the wall, but there was considerable slack in the chains that shackled his wrists, and before the bullet-shaped head could be withdrawn out of reach, the king gathered this slack in his mighty hand and smote the black on the head. The man fell like a butchered ox, and his comrades stared to see him lying with his scalp laid open and blood oozing from his nose and ears. But they attempted no reprisal, nor did they accept Conan's urgent invitation to approach within reach of the bloody chain in his hand. Presently, grunting in their guttural speech, they lifted the senseless black and bore him out like a sack of wheat, arms and legs dangling. They used his key to lock the door behind them, but did not remove it from the gold chain that fastened it to his girdle. They took the torch with them, and as they moved up the corridor, the darkness slunk behind them like an animate thing. Their soft padding footsteps died away with the glimmer of their torch, and darkness and silence remained unchallenged. 5. The Haunter of the Pits. Conan lay still, enduring the weight of his chains and the despair of his position with the stoicism of the wiles that had bred him. He did not move, because the jangle of his chains, when he shifted his body, sounded startlingly loud in the darkness and stillness, and it was his instinct, born of 1,000 wilderness-bred ancestors, not to betray his position in his helplessness. This did not result from a logical reasoning process. He did not lie quiet because he reasoned that the darkness hid lurking dangers that might discover him in his helplessness. Saul Toten had assured him that he was not to be harmed, and Conan believed that it was in the man's interest to preserve him, at least for the time being. But the instincts of the wild were there that had caused him in his childhood to lie hidden and silent, while wild beasts prowled about his covert. Even his keen eyes could not pierce the solid darkness. Yet after a while, after a period of time he had no way of estimating, a faint glow became apparent, a sort of slanting gray beam by which Conan could see vaguely the bars of the door at his elbow and even make out the skeleton of the other grille. This puzzled him until at last he realized the explanation. He was far below ground, in the pits below the palace, yet for some reason a shaft had been constructed from somewhere above. Outside, the moon had risen to a point where its light slanted dimly down the shaft. He reflected that in this manner he could tell the passing of the days and nights. Perhaps the sun, too, would shine down that shaft, though, on the other hand, it might be closed by day. Perhaps it was a subtle method of torture, allowing a prisoner but a glimpse of daylight or moonlight. His gaze fell on the broken bones in the farther corner, glimmering dimly. He did not tax his brain with futile speculation as to who the wretch had been and for what reason he had been doomed, but he wondered at the shattered condition of the bones. They had not been broken on a rack. Then, as he looked, another unsavory detail made itself evident. The shin bones were split lengthwise, and there was but one explanation. They had been broken in that manner in order to obtain the marrow. Yet what creature but man breaks bones for their marrow? Perhaps those remnants were mute evidence of a horrible, cannibalistic feast, of some wretch driven to madness by starvation. Conan wondered if his own bones would be found at some future date, hanging in their rusty chains. He fought down the unreasoning panic of a trapped wolf. The Cimmerian did not curse, scream, weep, or rave as a civilized man might have done, but the pain and turmoil in his bosom were none the less fierce. His great limbs quivered with the intensity of his emotions. Somewhere far to the westward, the Nemedian host was slashing and burning its way through the heart of his kingdom. The small host of the Poetanians could not stand before them. Prospero might be able to hold Tarantio for weeks or months, but eventually, if not relieved, he must surrender to greater numbers. Surely the barons would rally to him against the invaders, but in the meanwhile he, Conan, must lie helpless in a darkened cell, while others led his spears and fought for his kingdom. The king ground his powerful teeth in red rage. Then he stiffened, as outside the farther door he heard a stealthy step. Straining his eyes, he made out a bent, indistinct figure outside the grill. There was a rasp of metal against metal, and he heard the clink of tumblers, as if a key had been turned in the lock. Then the figure moved silently out of his range of vision. Some guard, he supposed, trying the lock. After a while he heard The sound repeated faintly somewhere farther on, and that was followed by the soft opening of a door, and then a swift scurry of softly shod feet retreated in the distance. Then silence fell again. Conan listened for what seemed a long time, but which could not have been, for the moon still shone down the hidden shaft, but he heard no further sound. He shifted his position at last, and his chains clanked. Then he heard another, lighter footfall, a soft step outside the nearer door, the door through which he had entered the cell. An instant later, a slender figure was etched dimly in the gray light. "King Conan," a soft voice intoned urgently. "Oh, my lord, are you there?"
"Where else?"
he answered guardedly, twisting his head about to stare at the apparition. It was a girl who stood grasping the bars with her slender fingers. The dim glow behind her outlined her supple figure through the wisp of silk twisted about her loins and shone vaguely on jeweled breastplates. Her dark eyes gleamed in the shadows. Her white limbs glistened softly like alabaster. Her hair was a mass of dark foam, at the burnished luster of which the dim light only hinted. "The keys to your shackles and to the farther door," she whispered, and a slim white hand came through the bars and dropped 3 objects with a clink to the flags beside him.
"What game is this?" he demanded. "You speak in the Nemedian tongue, and I have no friends in Nemedia. What deviltry is your master up to now? Has he sent you here to mock me?"
"It is no mockery." The girl was trembling violently. Her bracelets and breastplates clinked against the bars. She grasped. "I swear by Mitra, I stole the keys from the black jailers. They are the keepers of the pits, and each bears a key which will open only one set of locks. I make them drunk. The one whose head you broke was carried away to a leech, and I could not get his key, but the others I stole. Oh, please do not loiter. Beyond these dungeons lie the pits which are the doors to hell." Somewhat impressed, Conan tried the keys dubiously, expecting to meet only failure and a burst of mocking laughter. But he was galvanized to discover that one indeed loosed him of his shackles, fitting not only the lock that held him to the ring, but the locks on his limbs as well. A few seconds later, he stood upright, exulting fiercely in his comparative freedom. A quick stride carried him to the grill, and his fingers closed about a bar and the slender wrist that was pressed against it, imprisoning the owner, who lifted her face bravely to his fierce gaze. "Who are you, girl?" he demanded. "Why do you do this?" "I am only Zenobia," she murmured, with a catch of breathlessness, as if in fright. "Only a girl of the king's seraglio." "Unless this is some cursed trick," muttered Conan, "I cannot see why you bring me these keys." She bowed her dark head and then lifted it and looked full into his suspicious eyes. Tears sparkled like jewels on her long dark lashes. "I am only a girl of the king's seraglio," she said, with a certain proud humility. "He has never glanced at me, and probably never will. I am less than one of the dogs that gnaw the bones in his banquet hall. But I am no painted toy. I am of flesh and blood. I breathe, hate, fear, rejoice, and love. And I have loved you, King Conan, ever since I saw you riding at the head of your knights along the streets of Belverus when you visited King Numa years ago. My heart tugged at its strings to leap from my bosom and fall in the dust of the street under your horse's hoofs." Color flooded her countenance as she spoke, but her dark eyes did not waver. Conan did not at once reply. Wild and passionate and untamed he was, yet any but the most brutish of men must be touched with a certain awe or wonder at the bearing of a woman's naked soul. She bent her head then and pressed her red lips to the fingers that imprisoned her slim wrist. Then she flung up her head as if in sudden recollection of their position, and terror flared in her dark eyes. "Haste," she whispered urgently. "It is past midnight. You must be gone."
"But won't they skin you alive for stealing these keys?"
"They'll never know. If the black men remember in the morning who gave them the wine, they will not dare admit the keys were stolen from them while they were drunk. The key that I could not obtain is the one that unlocks this door. You must make your way to freedom through the pits. What awful perils lurk beyond that door I cannot even guess. But greater danger lurks for you if you remain in this cell. King Tarascus has returned."
"What? Tarascus?"
"Aye, he has returned in great secrecy, and not long ago he descended into the pits and then came out again, pale and shaking, like a man who has dared a great hazard. I heard him whisper to his squire, Aridius, that, despite Zoltoten, you should die."
"What of Zoltoten?"
murmured Conan. He felt her shudder.
"Do not speak of him," she whispered. "Demons are often summoned by the sound of their names. The slaves say that he lies in his chamber behind a bolted door, dreaming the dreams of the Black Lotus. I believe that even Tarascus secretly fears him, or he would slay you openly. But he has been in the pits tonight, and what he did here only Mitra knows." "I wonder if that could have been Tarascus who fumbled at my cell door a while ago," muttered Conan. "Here is a dagger," she whispered, pressing something through the bars. His eager fingers closed on an object familiar to their touch. "Go quickly through yonder door, turn to the left, and make your way along the cells until you come to a stone stair. On your life, do not stray from the line of the cells. Climb the stair and open the door at the top. One of the keys will fit it. If it be the will of Mitra, I will await you there." Then she was gone with a patter of light, slippered feet. Conan shrugged his shoulders and turned toward the farther grill. This might be some diabolical trap planned by Tarascus, but plunging headlong into a snare was less abhorrent to Conan's temperament than sitting meekly to await his doom. He inspected the weapon the girl had given him and smiled grimly. Whatever else she might be, she was proven by that dagger to be a person of practical intelligence. It was no slender stiletto, selected because of a jeweled hilt or gold guard, fitted only for dainty murder in Milady's boudoir. It was a forthright poniard, a warrior's weapon, broad-bladed, 15 inches in length, tapering to a diamond-sharp point. He grunted with satisfaction. The feel of the hilt cheered him and gave him a glow of confidence. Whatever webs of conspiracy were drawn about him, whatever trickery and treachery ensnared him, this knife was real. The great muscles of his right arm swelled in anticipation of murderous blows. He tried the farther door, fumbling with the keys as he did so. It was not locked. Yet he remembered the black man locking it. That furtive, bent figure, then, had been no jailer, seeing that the bolts were in place. He had unlocked the door instead. There was a sinister suggestion about that unlocked door. But Conan did not hesitate. He pushed open the grill and stepped from the dungeon into the outer darkness. As he had thought, the door did not open into another corridor. The flagged floor stretched away under his feet, and the line of cells ran away to the right and left behind him. But he could not make out the other limits of the place into which he had come. He could see neither the roof nor any other wall. The moonlight filtered into the vastness only through the grills of the cells, and was almost lost in the darkness. Less keen eyes than his could scarcely have discerned the dim gray patches that floated before each cell door. Turning to the left, he moved swiftly and noiselessly along the line of dungeons, his bare feet making no sound on the flags. He glanced briefly into each dungeon as he passed it. They were all empty, but locked. In some, he caught the glimmer of naked white bones. These pits were a relic of a grimmer age, constructed long ago when Belverus was a fortress rather than a city. But evidently their more recent use had been more extensive than the world guessed. Ahead of him presently, he saw the dim outline of a stair sloping sharply upward, and he knew it must be the stair he sought. Then he whirled suddenly, crouching in the deep shadows at its foot. Somewhere behind him something was moving, something bulky and stealthy that padded on feet which were not human feet. He was looking down the long row of cells, before each one of which lay a square of dim gray light that was little more than a patch of less dense darkness. But he saw something moving along these squares. What it was he could not tell, but it was heavy and huge, and yet it moved with more than human ease and swiftness. He glimpsed it as it moved across the squares of gray, then lost it as it merged in the expanses of shadow between. It was uncanny in its stealthy advance, appearing and disappearing like a blur of the vision. He heard the bars rattle as it tried each door in turn. Now it had reached the cell he had so recently quitted, and the door swung open as it tugged. He saw a great bulky shape limned faintly and briefly in the gray doorway, and then the thing had vanished into the dungeon. Sweat beaded Conan's face and hands. Now he knew why Tarascus had come so subtly to his door and later had fled so swiftly. The king had unlocked his door, and somewhere in these hellish pits had opened a cell or cage that held some grim monstrosity. Now the thing was emerging from the cell and was again advancing up the corridor, its misshapen head close to the ground. It paid no more heed to the locked doors. It was smelling out his trail. He saw it more plainly now. The gray light limned a giant anthropomorphic body, but vaster of bulk and girth than any man. It went on 2 legs, though it stooped forward, and it was grayish and shaggy, its thick coat shot with silver. Its head was a grisly travesty of the human. Its long arms hung nearly to the ground. Conan knew it at last, understood the meaning of those crushed and broken bones in the dungeon, and recognized the haunter of the pits. It was a gray ape, one of the grisly man-eaters from the forests that wave on the mountainous eastern shores of the Sea of Vilayet. Half mythical and altogether horrible, these apes were the goblins of Iborian legendary, and were in reality ogres of the natural world, cannibals and murderers of the nighted forests. He knew it scented his presence, for it was coming swiftly now, rolling its barrel-like body rapidly along on its short, mighty bowed legs. He cast a quick glance up the long stair, but knew that the thing would be on his back before he could mount to the distant door. He chose to meet it face to face.
Conan stepped out into the nearest square of moonlight, so as to have all the advantage of illumination that he could, for the beast, he knew, could see better than himself in the dark. Instantly the brute saw him. Its great yellow tusks gleamed in the shadows, but it made no sound. Creatures of night and the silence, the gray apes of Vilayet were voiceless, but in its dim, hideous features, which were a bestial travesty of a human face, showed ghastly exultation. Conan stood poised, watching the oncoming monster without a quiver. He knew he must stake his life on one thrust. There would be no chance for another, nor would there be time to strike and spring away. The first blow must kill, and kill instantly, if he hoped to survive that awful grapple. He swept his gaze over the short, squat throat, the hairy, swag belly, and the mighty breast swelling in giant arches like twin shields. It must be the heart. Better to risk the blade being deflected by the heavy ribs than to strike in where a stroke was not instantly fatal. With full realization of the odds, Conan matched his speed of eye and hand and his muscular power against the brute might and ferocity of the man-eater. He must meet the brute breast to breast, strike a death blow, and then trust to the ruggedness of his frame to survive the instant of manhandling that was certain to be his. As the ape came rolling in on him, swinging wide its terrible arms, he plunged in between them and struck with all his desperate power. He felt the blade sink to the hilt in the hairy breast, and instantly releasing it, he ducked his head and bunched his whole body into one compact mass of knotted muscles, and as he did so, he grasped the closing arms and drove his knee fiercely into the monster's belly, bracing himself against that crushing grapple. For one dizzy instant, he felt as if he were being dismembered in the grip of an earthquake. Then suddenly he was free, sprawling on the floor, and the monster was gasping out its life beneath him, its red eyes turned upward, the hilt of the poniard quivering in its breast. His desperate stab had gone home. Conan was panting as if after long conflict, trembling in every limb. Some of his joints felt as if they had been dislocated, and blood dripped from scratches on his skin where the monster's talons had ripped. His muscles and tendons had been savagely wrenched and twisted. If the beast had lived a second longer, it would surely have dismembered him. But the Cimmerian's mighty strength had resisted. For the fleeting instant, it had endured the dying convulsion of the ape that would have torn a lesser man limb from limb. 6. The thrust of a knife. Conan stooped and tore the knife from the monster's breast. Then he went swiftly up the stair. What other shapes of fear the darkness held he could not guess, but he had no desire to encounter any more. This touch-and-go sort of battling was too strenuous, even for the giant Cimmerian. The moonlight was fading from the floor, the darkness closing in, and something like panic pursued him up the stair. He breathed a gusty sigh of relief when he reached the head and felt the third key turn in the lock. He opened the door slightly and craned his neck to peer through, half expecting an attack from some human or bestial enemy. He looked into a bare stone corridor, dimly lighted, and a slender, supple figure stood before the door. "Your Majesty." It was a low, vibrant cry, half in relief and half in fear. The girl sprang to his side, then hesitated, as if abashed. "You bleed," she said. "You have been hurt." He brushed aside the implication with an impatient hand. "Scratches that wouldn't hurt a baby. Your skewer came in handy, though. But for it, Tarascus's monkey would be cracking my shin bones for the marrow right now. But what now?" "Follow me," she whispered. "I will lead you outside the city wall. I have a horse concealed there." She turned to lead the way down the corridor, but he laid a heavy hand on her naked shoulder. "Walk beside me," he instructed her softly, passing his massive arm about her lithe waist. "You've played me fair so far, and I'm inclined to believe in you. But I've lived this long only because I've trusted no one too far, man or woman. So, now if you play me false, you won't live to enjoy the jest." She did not flinch at sight of the reddened poniard or the contact of his hard muscles about her supple body. "Cut me down without mercy if I play you false," she answered. "The very feel of your arm about me, even in menace, is as the fulfillment of a dream." The vaulted corridor ended at a door which she opened. Outside lay another black man, a giant in turban and silk loincloth, with a curved sword lying on the flags near his hand. He did not move. "I drugged his wine," she whispered, swerving to avoid the recumbent figure. "He is the last and outer guard of the pits. None ever escaped from them before, and none has ever wished to seek them, so only these black men guard them. Only these of all the servants knew it was King Conan that Zoltoten brought a prisoner in his chariot. I was watching, sleepless, from an upper casement that opened into the court, while the other girls slept, for I knew that a battle was being fought, or had been fought, in the west, and I feared for you. I saw the blacks carry you up the stair, and I recognized you in the torchlight. I slipped into this wing of the palace tonight in time to see them carry you to the pits. I had not dared come here before nightfall. You must have lain in drugged senselessness all day in Zoltoten's chamber. Oh, let us be wary. Strange things are afoot in the palace tonight. The slaves said that Zoltoten slept as he often sleeps, drugged by the lotus of Stygia. But Tarascus is in the palace. He entered secretly through the postern, wrapped in his cloak, which was dusty as with long travel, and attended only by his squire, the lean, silent Aridios. I cannot understand, but I am afraid." They came out at the foot of a narrow, winding stair, and, mounting it, passed through a narrow panel, which she slid aside. When they had passed through, she slipped it back in place, and it became merely a portion of the ornate wall. They were in a more spacious corridor, carpeted and tapestried, over which hanging lamps shed a golden glow. Conan listened intently, but he heard no sound throughout the palace. He did not know in what part of the palace he was, or in which direction lay the chamber of Zoltoten. The girl was trembling as she drew him along the corridor, to halt presently beside an alcove masked with satin tapestry. Drawing this aside, she motioned for him to step into the niche, and whispered, "Wait here. Beyond that door at the end of the corridor, we are likely to meet slaves or eunuchs at any time of the day or night. I will go and see if the way is clear before we essay it." Instantly his hair-trigger suspicions were aroused. "Are you leading me into a trap?" Tears sprang into her dark eyes. She sank to her knees and seized his muscular hand. "Oh, my king, do not mistrust me now." Her voice shook with desperate urgency. "If you doubt and hesitate, we are lost. Why should I bring you up out of the pits to betray you now?" "All right," he muttered. "I'll trust you, though by Crom the habits of a lifetime are not easily put aside. Yet I wouldn't harm you now if you brought all the swordsmen in Numidia upon me. But for you, Tarascus's cursed ape would have come upon me in chains and unarmed. Do as you wish, girl." Kissing his hands, she sprang lithely up and ran down the corridor to vanish through a heavy double door. He glanced after her, wondering if he was a fool to trust her. Then he shrugged his mighty shoulders and pulled the satin hangings together, masking his refuge. It was not strange that a passionate young beauty should be risking her life to aid him. Such things had happened often enough in his life. Many women had looked on him with favor in the days of his wanderings and in the time of his kingship. Yet he did not remain motionless in the alcove, waiting for her return. Following his instinct, he explored the niche for another exit and presently found one, the opening of a narrow passage, masked by the tapestries, that ran to an ornately carved door, barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the outer corridor. And as he stared into it, somewhere beyond that carven door, he heard the sound of another door opening and shutting, and then a low mumble of voices. The familiar sound of one of those voices caused a sinister expression to cross his dark face. Without hesitation, he glided down the passage and crouched like a stalking panther beside the door. It was not locked, and manipulating it delicately, he pushed it open a crack with a reckless disregard for possible consequences that only he could have explained or defended. It was masked on the other side by tapestries, but through a thin slit in the velvet he looked into a chamber lit by a candle on an ebony table. There were 2 men in that chamber. One was a scarred, sinister-looking ruffian in leather breeks and ragged cloak. The other was Tarascus, king of Numidia. Tarascus seemed ill at ease. He was slightly pale, and he kept starting and glancing about him, as if expecting and fearing to hear some sound or footstep. "Go swiftly, and at once," he was saying. "He is deep in drugged slumber, but I know not when he may awaken." "Strange to hear words of fear issuing from the lips of Tarascus," rumbled the other in a harsh, deep voice. The king frowned. "I fear no common man, as you well know, but when I saw the cliffs fall at Valkia, I knew that this devil we had resurrected was no charlatan. I fear his powers, because I do not know the full extent of them, but I know that somehow they are connected with this accursed thing which I have stolen from him. It brought him back to life, so it must be the source of his sorcery. He had it hidden well, but following my secret order, a slave spied on him and saw him place it in a golden chest, and saw where he hid the chest. Even so, I would not have dared steal it, had Zoltoten himself not been sunk in lotus slumber. I believe it is the secret of his power. With it, Orastes brought him back to life. With it he will make us all slaves if we are not wary. So take it, and cast it into the sea as I have bidden you, and be sure you are so far from land that neither tide nor storm can wash it up on the beach. You have been paid." "So I have," grunted the ruffian, "and I owe more than gold to you, king. I owe you a debt of gratitude. Even thieves can be grateful." "Whatever debt you may feel you owe me," answered Tarascus, "will be paid when you have hurled this thing into the sea." "I'll ride for Zingara and take ship from Cordava," promised the other. "I dare not show my head in Argos because of a matter of a murder or so. I care not, so it is done. Here it is. A horse awaits you in the court. Go, and go swiftly." Something passed between them, something that flamed like living fire. Conan had only a brief glimpse of it, and then the ruffian pulled a slouch hat over his eyes, drew his cloak about his shoulder, and hurried from the chamber. And as the door closed behind him, Conan moved with the devastating fury of unchained bloodlust. He had held himself in check as long as he could. The sight of his enemies so near him set his wild blood seething and swept away all caution and restraint. Tarascus was turning toward an inner door when Conan tore aside the hangings and leaped like a blood-mad panther into the room. Tarascus wheeled, but even before he could recognize his attacker, Conan's poniard ripped into him. But the blow was not mortal, as Conan knew the instant he struck. His foot had caught in a fold of the curtains and tripped him as he leaped. The point fleshed itself in Tarascus's shoulder and plowed down along his ribs, and the king of Nemedia screamed. The impact of the blow and Conan's lunging body hurled him back against the table, and it toppled, and the candle went out. They were both carried to the floor by the violence of Conan's rush, and the foot of the tapestry hampered them both in its folds. Conan was stabbing blindly in the dark, Tarascus screaming in a frenzy of panicky terror. As if fear lent him superhuman energy, Tarascus tore free and blundered away in the darkness, shrieking, "Help! Guards! Aridius! Orastes! Orastes!" Conan rose, kicking himself free of the tangling tapestries and the broken table, cursing with the bitterness of his bloodthirsty disappointment. He was confused and ignorant of the plan of the palace. The yells of Tarascus were still resounding in the distance, and a wild outcry was bursting forth in answer. The Nemedian had escaped him in the darkness, and Conan did not know which way he had gone. The Cimmerian's rash stroke for vengeance had failed, and there remained only the task of saving his own hide if he could. Swearing luridly, Conan ran back down the passage and into the alcove, glaring out into the lighted corridor, just as Zenobia came running up it, her dark eyes dilated with terror. "Oh, what has happened?" she cried. "The palace is roused. I swear I have not betrayed you." "No, it was I who stirred up this hornet's nest," he grunted. "I tried to pay off a score. What's the shortest way out of this?" She caught his wrist and ran fleetly down the corridor, but before they reached the heavy door at the other end, muffled shouts arose from behind it, and the portals began to shake under an assault from the other side. Zenobia wrung her hands and whimpered, "We are cut off. I locked that door as I returned through it, but they will burst it in a moment. The way to the postern gate lies through it." Conan wheeled. Up the corridor, though still out of sight, he heard a rising clamor that told him his foes were behind as well as before him. "Quick, into this door," the girl cried desperately, running across the corridor and throwing open the door of a chamber. Conan followed her through, and then through the gold catch behind them. They stood in an ornately furnished chamber, empty but for themselves, and she drew him to a gold-barred window, through which he saw trees and shrubbery. "You are strong," she panted. "If you can tear these bars away, you may yet escape. The garden is full of guards, but the shrubs are thick, and you may avoid them. The southern wall is also the outer wall of the city. Once over that, you have a chance to get away. A horse is hidden for you in a thicket beside the road that runs westward, a few hundred paces to the south of the fountain of Thralos. You know where it is?" Aye, but what of you? I had meant to take you with me. A flood of joy lighted her beautiful face. Then my cup of happiness is brimming, but I will not hamper your escape. Burdened with me, you would fail. Nay, do not fear for me. They will never suspect that I aided you willingly. Go. What you have just said will glorify my life throughout the long years. He caught her up in his iron arms, crushed her slim, vibrant figure to him, and kissed her fiercely on eyes, cheeks, throat, and lips, until she lay panting in his embrace, gusty and tempestuous as a storm wind. Even his lovemaking was violent. "I'll go," he muttered, "but by Crom, I'll come for you some day." Wheeling, he gripped the gold bars and tore them from their sockets with one tremendous wrench, threw a leg over the sill, and went down swiftly, clinging to the ornaments on the wall. He hit the ground running and melted like a shadow into the maze of towering rose bushes and spreading trees. The one look he cast back over his shoulder showed him Zenobia leaning over the windowsill, her arms stretched after him in mute farewell and renunciation. Guards were running through the garden, all converging toward the palace, where the clamor momentarily grew louder. Tall men in burnished cuirasses and crested helmets of polished bronze. The starlight struck glints from their gleaming armor among the trees, betraying their every movement, but the sound of their coming ran far before them. To Conan, wilderness bred, their rush through the shrubbery was like the blundering stampede of cattle. Some of them passed within a few feet of where he lay flat in a thick cluster of bushes, and never guessed his presence. With the palace as their goal, they were oblivious to all else about them. When they had gone shouting on, he rose and fled through the garden with no more noise than a panther would have made. So quickly he came to the southern wall and mounted the steps that led to the parapet. The wall was made to keep people out, not in. No sentry patrolling the battlements was in sight. Crouching by an embrasure, he glanced back at the great palace, rearing above the cypresses behind him. Lights blazed from every window, and he could see figures flitting back and forth across them like puppets on invisible strings. He grinned hardly, shook his fist in a gesture of farewell and menace, and let himself over the outer rim of the parapet. A low tree, a few yards below the parapet, received Conan's weight as he dropped noiselessly into the branches. An instant later he was racing through the shadows with the swinging hillman's stride that eats up long miles. Gardens and pleasure villas surrounded the walls of Belverus. Drowsy slaves, sleeping by their watchmen's pikes, did not see the swift and furtive figure that scaled walls, crossed alleys made by the arching branches of trees, and threaded a noiseless way through orchards and vineyards. Watchdogs woke and lifted their deep booming clamor at a gliding shadow, half-scented, half-sensed, and then it was gone. In a chamber of the palace, Tarascus writhed and cursed on a blood-spattered couch under the deft, quick fingers of Orestes. The palace was thronged with wide-eyed, trembling servitors, but the chamber where the king lay was empty, save for himself and the renegade priest. "Are you sure he still sleeps?" Tarascus demanded again, setting his teeth against the bite of the herb juices with which Orestes was bandaging the long, ragged gash in his shoulder and ribs. "Istar, Mitra, and Set. That burns like the molten pitch of hell." "Which you would be experiencing even now but for your good fortune," remarked Orestes. "Whoever wielded that knife struck to kill. Yes, I have told you that Zoltoten still sleeps. Why are you so urgent upon that point? What has he to do with this?" "You know nothing of what has passed in the palace tonight?" Tarascus searched the priest's countenance with burning intensity. "Nothing. As you know, I have been employed in translating manuscripts for Zoltoten for some months now, transcribing esoteric volumes written in the younger languages into script he can read. He was well versed in all the tongues and scripts of his day, but he has not yet learned all the newer languages, and to save time, he has me translate these works for him, to learn if any new knowledge has been discovered since his time. I did not know that he had returned last night until he sent for me and told me of the battle. Then I returned to my studies, nor did I know that you had returned until the clamor in the palace brought me out of my cell." "Then you did not know that Zoltoten brought the king of Aquilonia a captive to this palace?" Orestes shook his head without particular surprise. "Zoltoten merely said that Conan would oppose us no more. I supposed that he had fallen, but did not ask the details." "Zoltoten saved his life when I would have slain him," snarled Tarascus. "I saw his purpose instantly. He would hold Conan captive to use as a club against us, against Amalric, against Valerius, and against myself. So long as Conan lives, he is a threat, a unifying factor for Aquilonia that might be used to compel us into courses we would not otherwise follow. I mistrust this undead Pythonian. Of late I have begun to fear him. I followed him. Some hours after he had departed eastward, I wished to learn what he intended doing with Conan. I found that he had imprisoned him in the pits. I intended to see that the barbarian died in spite of Zoltoten, and I accomplished... A cautious knock sounded at the door. "That's Aridius," grunted Tarascus. "Let him in." The saturnine squire entered, his eyes blazing with suppressed excitement. "How, Aridius?" exclaimed Tarascus. "Have you found the man who attacked me?" "You did not see him, my lord?" asked Aridius. As one who would assure himself of a fact he already knows to exist, "You did not recognize him?" "No. It happened so quick, and the candle was out. All I could think of was that it was some devil loosed on me by Zoltoten's magic. The Pythonian sleeps in his barred and bolted room, but I have been in the pits." Aridius twitched his lean shoulders excitedly. "Well, speak, man!" exclaimed Tarascus impatiently. "What did you find there?" "An empty dungeon," whispered the squire. "The corpse of the great ape." "What?" Tarascus started upright, and blood gushed from his opened wound. "Aye, the man-eater is dead, stabbed through the heart, and Conan is gone." Tarascus was gray of face as he mechanically allowed Orestes to force him prostrate again, and the priest renewed work upon his mangled flesh. "Conan," he repeated, "not a crushed corpse, escaped. Mitra, he is no man, but a devil himself. I thought Zoltoten was behind this wound. I see now. Gods and devils, it was Conan who stabbed me. Aridius!" "Aye, your majesty." "Search every nook in the palace. He may be skulking through the dark corridors now like a hungry tiger. Let no niche escape your scrutiny, and beware, it is not a civilized man you hunt, but a blood-mad barbarian whose strength and ferocity are those of a wild beast. Scour the palace grounds and the city. Throw a cordon about the walls. If you find he has escaped from the city, as he may well do, take a troop of horsemen and follow him. Once past the walls, it will be like hunting a wolf through the hills. But haste, and you may yet catch him." "This is a matter which requires more than ordinary human wits," said Orestes. "Perhaps we should seek Zoltoten's advice." "No!" exclaimed Tarascus violently. "Let the troopers pursue Conan and slay him. Zoltoten can hold no grudge against us if we kill a prisoner to prevent his escape." "Well," said Orestes, "I am no Acheronian, but I am versed in some of the arts, and the control of certain spirits which have cloaked themselves in material substance. Perhaps I can aid you in this matter." The fountain of Thrallos stood in a clustered ring of oaks beside the road, a mile from the walls of the city. Its musical tinkle reached Conan's ears through the silence of the starlight. He drank deep of its icy stream, and then hurried southward toward a small, dense thicket he saw there. Rounding it, he saw a great white horse tied among the bushes. Heaving a deep, gusty sigh, he reached it with one stride. A mocking laugh brought him about, glaring. A dully glinting, mail-clad figure moved out of the shadows into the starlight. This was no plumed and burnished palace guardsman. It was a tall man in morion and great chainmail, one of the adventurers, a class of warriors peculiar to Numidia, men who had not attained to the wealth and position of knighthood, or had fallen from that estate, hard-bitten fighters, dedicating their lives to war and adventure. They constituted a class of their own, sometimes commanding troops, but themselves accountable to no man but the king. Conan knew that he could have been discovered by no more dangerous a foeman. A quick glance among the shadows convinced him that the man was alone, and he expanded his great chest slightly, digging his toes into the turf as his thews coiled tensely. "I was riding for Belverus on Almeric's business," said the adventurer, advancing warily. The starlight was a long sheen on the great two-handed sword he bore naked in his hand. "A horse whinnied to mine from the thicket. I investigated and thought it strange a steed should be tethered here. I waited, and lo, I have caught a rare prize." The adventurers lived by their swords. "I know you," muttered the Numidian. "You are Conan, king of Aquilonia. I thought I saw you die in the valley of the Volkia, but—" Conan sprang as a dying tiger springs. Practiced fighter though the adventurer was, he did not realize the desperate quickness that lurks in barbaric sinews. He was caught off guard, his heavy sword half lifted. Before he could either strike or parry, the king's poniard sheathed itself in his throat above the gorget. slanting downward into his heart. With a choked gurgle, he reeled and went down, and Conan ruthlessly tore his blade free as his victim fell. The white horse snorted violently and shied at the sight and scent of blood on the sword. Glaring down at his lifeless enemy, dripping poniard in hand, sweat glistening on his broad breast, Conan poised like a statue, listening intently. In the woods about, there was no sound, save for the sleepy cheep of awakened birds. But in the city, a mile away, he heard the strident blare of a trumpet. Hastily, he bent over the fallen man. A few seconds' search convinced him that whatever message the man might have borne was intended to be conveyed by word of mouth. But he did not pause in his task. It was not many hours until dawn. A few minutes later, the white horse was galloping westward along the white road, and the rider wore the gray mail of an Amadian adventurer. 7. The Rending of the Veil. Conan knew his only chance of escape lay in speed. He did not even consider hiding somewhere near Belvaris until the chase passed on. He was certain that the uncanny ally of Tarascus would be able to ferret him out. Besides, he was not one to skulk and hide. An open fight or an open chase, either suited his temperament better. He had a long start, he knew. He would lead them a grinding race for the border. Zenobia had chosen well in selecting the white horse. His speed, toughness, and endurance were obvious. The girl knew weapons and horses, and, Conan reflected with some satisfaction, she knew men. He rode westward at a gait that ate up the miles. It was a sleeping land through which he rode, past grove-sheltered villages and white-walled villas amid spacious fields and orchards that grew sparser as he fared westward. As the villages thinned, the land grew more rugged, and the keeps that frowned from eminences told of centuries of border war. But none rode down from those castles to challenge or halt him. The lords of the keeps were following the banner of Amalric. The pennons that were wont to wave over these towers were now floating over the Aquilonian plains. When the last huddled village fell behind him, Conan left the road, which was beginning to bend toward the northwest, toward the distant passes. To keep to the road would mean to pass by border towers, still garrisoned with armed men who would not allow him to pass unquestioned. He knew there would be no patrols riding the border marches on either side, as in ordinary times. But there were those towers, and with dawn there would probably be cavalcades of returning soldiers with wounded men in ox carts. This road from Belvaris was the only road that crossed the border for 50 miles from north to south. It followed a series of passes through the hills, and on either hand lay a wide expanse of wild, sparsely inhabited mountains. He maintained his due westerly direction, intending to cross the border deep in the wilds of the hills that lay to the south of the passes. It was a shorter route, more arduous, but safer for a hunted fugitive. One man on a horse could traverse country an army would find impassable. But at dawn he had not reached the hills. They were a long, low blue rampart stretching along the horizon ahead of him. Here there were neither farms nor villages, no white-walled villas looming among the clustering trees. The dawn wind stirred the tall, stiff grass, and there was nothing but the long, rolling swells of brown earth covered with dry grass, and in the distance the gaunt walls of a stronghold on a low hill. Too many Aquilonian raiders had crossed the mountains in not too distant days for the countryside to be thickly settled, as it was farther to the east. Dawn ran like a prairie fire across the grasslands, and high overhead sounded a weird crying as a straggling wedge of wild geese winged swiftly southward. In a grassy swale, Conan halted and unsaddled his mount. Its sides were heaving, its coat plastered with sweat. He had pushed it unmercifully through the hours before dawn. While it munched the brittle grass and rolled, he lay at the crest of the low slope staring eastward. Far away to the northward, he could see the road he had left, streaming like a white ribbon over a distant rise. No black dots moved along that glistening ribbon. There was no sign about the castle in the distance to indicate that the keepers had noticed the lone wayfarer. An hour later, the land still stretched bare. The only sign of life was a glint of steel on the far-off battlements, a raven in the sky that wheeled backward and forth, dipping and rising as if seeking something. Conan saddled and rode westward at a more leisurely gait. As he topped the farther crest of the slope, a raucous screaming burst out over his head, and looking up, he saw the raven flapping high above him, cawing incessantly. As he rode on, it followed him, maintaining its position and making the morning hideous with its strident cries, heedless of his efforts to drive it away. This kept up for hours until Conan's teeth were on edge, and he felt that he would give half his kingdom to be allowed to wring that black neck. "Devils of hell!" he roared in futile rage, shaking his mailed fist at the frantic bird. "Why do you harry me with your squawking? Be gone, you black spawn of perdition, and peck for wheat in the farmer's fields." He was ascending the first pitch of the hills, and he seemed to hear an echo of the bird's clamor far behind him. Turning in his saddle, he presently made out another black dot hanging in the blue. Beyond that again he caught the glint of the afternoon sun on steel. That could mean only one thing: armed men. And they were not riding along the beaten road, which was out of his sight beyond the horizon. They were following him. His face grew grim, and he shivered slightly as he stared at the raven that wheeled high above him. "So it is more than the whim of a brainless beast," he muttered. "Those riders cannot see you, spawn of hell, but the other bird can see you, and they can see him. You follow me, he follows you, and they follow him. Are you only a craftily trained, feathered creature, or some devil in the form of a bird? Did Zoltoten set you on my trail? Are you Zoltoten?" Only a strident screech answered him, a screech vibrating with harsh mockery. Conan wasted no more breath on his dusky betrayer. Grimly he settled to the long grind of the hills. He dared not push the horse too hard. The rest he had allowed it had not been enough to freshen it. He was still far ahead of his pursuers, but they would cut down that lead steadily. It was almost a certainty that their horses were fresher than his, for they had undoubtedly changed mounts at that castle he had passed. The going grew rougher, the scenery more rugged, steep grassy slopes pitching up to densely timbered mountainsides. Here, he knew, he might elude his hunters, but for that hellish bird that squalled incessantly above him. He could no longer see them in this broken country, but he was certain that they still followed him, guided unerringly by their feathered allies. That black shape became like a demoniac incubus, hounding him through measureless hells. The stones he hurled with a curse went wide or fell harmless, though in his youth he had felt hawks on the wing. The horse was tiring fast. Conan recognized the grim finality of his position. He sensed an inexorable driving fate behind all this. He could not escape. He was as much a captive as he had been in the pits of Belverus. But he was no son of the Orient to yield passively to what seemed inevitable. If he could not escape, he would at least take some of his foes into eternity with him. He turned into a wide thicket of larches that masked a slope, looking for a place to turn at bay. Then ahead of him there rang a strange, shrill scream, human yet weirdly timbred. An instant later he had pushed through a screen of branches and saw the source of that eldritch cry. In a small glade below him, 4 soldiers in the Median chainmail were binding a noose about the neck of a gaunt old woman in peasant garb. A heap of faggots bound with cord on the ground nearby showed what her occupation had been when surprised by these stragglers. Conan felt slow fury swell his heart as he looked silently down and saw the ruffians dragging her toward a tree whose low-spreading branches were obviously intended to act as a gibbet. He had crossed the frontier an hour ago. He was standing on his own soil, watching the murder of one of his own subjects. The old woman was struggling with surprising strength and energy, and as he watched, she lifted her head and voiced again the strange, weird, far-carrying call he had heard before. It was echoed as if in mockery by the raven flapping above the trees. The soldiers laughed roughly, and one struck her in the mouth. Conan swung from his weary steed and dropped down the face of the rocks, landing with a clang of mail on the grass. The 4 men wheeled at the sound and drew their swords, gaping at the male giant who faced them, sword in hand. Conan laughed harshly. His eyes were bleak as flint. "Dogs!" he said, without passion and without mercy. "Do Nemedian jackals set themselves up as executioners and hang my subjects at will? First you must take the head of their king. Here I stand, awaiting your lordly pleasure." The soldiers stared at him uncertainly as he strode toward them. "Who is this madman?" growled a bearded ruffian. "He wears Nemedian mail, but speaks with an Aquilonian accent." "No matter," quoth another. "Cut him down, and then we'll hang the old hag." And so saying, he ran at Conan, lifting his sword. But before he could strike, the king's great blade lashed down, splitting helmet and skull. The man fell before him, but the others were hardy rogues. They gave tongue like wolves and surged about the lone figure in the gray mail, and the clamor and din of steel drowned the cries of the circling raven. Conan did not shout. His eyes coals of blue fire and his lips smiling bleakly, he lashed right and left with his two-handed sword. For all his size, he was quick as a cat on his feet, and he was constantly in motion, presenting a moving target so that thrusts and swings cut empty air oftener than not. Yet when he struck, he was perfectly balanced, and his blows fell with devastating power. 3 of the 4 were down, dying in their own blood, and the 4th was bleeding from half a dozen wounds, stumbling in headlong retreat as he parried frantically, when Conan's spur caught in the surcoat of one of the fallen men. The king stumbled, and before he could catch himself, the Nemedian, with the frenzy of desperation, rushed him so savagely that Conan staggered and fell sprawling over the corpse. The Nemedian croaked in triumph and sprang forward, lifting his great sword with both hands over his right shoulder as he braced his legs wide for the stroke. And then, over the prostrate king, something huge and hairy shot like a thunderbolt full on the shoulder's breast, and his yelp of triumph changed to a shriek of death. Conan, scrambling up, saw the man lying dead with his throat torn out, and a great gray wolf stood over him, head sunk as it smelt the blood that formed a pool on the grass. The king turned as the old woman spoke to him. She stood straight and tall before him, and in spite of a ragged garb, her features, clear-cut and aquiline, and her keen black eyes, were not those of a common peasant woman. She called to the wolf, and it trotted to her side like a great dog and rubbed its giant shoulder against her knee, while it gazed at Conan with great green lambent eyes. Absently she laid her hand upon its mighty neck, and so the two stood regarding the king of Aquilonia. He found their steady gaze disquieting, though there was no hostility in it. "Men say King Conan died beneath the stones and dirt when the cliffs crumbled by Valkia," she said in a deep, strong, resonant voice. "So they say," he growled. He was in no mood for controversy, and he thought of those armored riders who were pushing nearer every moment. The raven above him cawed stridently, and he cast an involuntary glare upward, grinding his teeth in a spasm of nervous irritation. Up on the ledge, the white horse stood with drooping head. The old woman looked at it, and then at the raven, and then she lifted a strange, weird cry as she had before. As if recognizing the call, the raven wheeled, suddenly mute, and raced eastward. But before it had got out of sight, the shadow of mighty wings fell across it. An eagle soared up from the tangle of trees, and rising above it, swooped and struck the black messenger to the earth. The strident voice of betrayal was stilled forever. "Crum!" muttered Conan, staring at the old woman. "Are you a magician, too?" "I am Zalata," she said. "The people of the valleys call me a witch. Was that child of the night guiding armed men on your trail?" "Aye." She did not seem to think the answer fantastic. "They cannot be far behind me." "Lead your horse and follow me, King Conan," she said briefly. Without comment, he mounted the rocks and brought his horse down to the glade by a circuitous path. As he came, he saw the eagle reappear, dropping lazily down from the sky, and rest an instant on Zalata's shoulder, spreading its great wings lightly so as not to crush her with its weight. Without a word, she led the way, the great wolf trotting at her side, the eagle soaring above her. Through deep thickets and along tortuous ledges poised over deep ravines she led him, and finally along a narrow, precipice-edged path to a curious dwelling of stone, half hut, half cavern, beneath a cliff hidden among the gorges and crags. The eagle flew to the pinnacle of this cliff and perched there like a motionless sentinel. Still silent, Zalata stabled the horse in a nearby cave, with leaves and grass piled high for provender, and a tiny spring bubbling in the dim recesses. In the hut she seated the king on a rude, hide-covered bench, and she herself sat upon a low stool before the tiny fireplace, while she made a fire of tamarisk chunks and prepared a frugal meal. The great wolf drowsed beside her, facing the fire, his huge head sunk on his paws, his ears twitching in his dreams. "You do not fear to sit in the hut of a witch?" she asked, breaking her silence at last. An impatient shrug of his gray-mailed shoulders was her guest's only reply. She gave into his hands a wooden dish, heaped with dried fruits, cheese, and barley bread, and a great pot of the heady upland beer, brewed from barley grown in the high valleys. "I have found the brooding silence of the glens more pleasing than the babble of city streets," she said. The children of the wild are kinder than the children of men." Her hand briefly stroked the ruff of the sleeping wolf. "My children were afar from me today, or I had not needed your sword, my king. They were coming at my call." "What grudge had those Nemedian dogs against you?" Conan demanded. "Skulkers from the invading army straggle all over the countryside, from the frontier to Tarantia," she answered. "The foolish villagers in the valleys told them that I had a store of gold hidden away, so as to divert their attentions from their villages. They demanded treasure from me, and my answers angered them. But neither skulkers nor the men who pursue you, nor any raven will find you here." He shook his head, eating ravenously. "I'm for Tarantia." She shook her head. "You thrust your head into the dragon's jaws. Best seek refuge abroad. The heart is gone from your kingdom." "What do you mean?" he demanded. "Battles have been lost before, yet wars won. A kingdom is not lost by a single defeat." "And you will go to Tarantia?" "Aye. Prospero will be holding it against Amalric." "Are you sure?" "Hell's devils, woman!" he exclaimed wrathfully. "What else?" She shook her head. "I feel that it is otherwise. Let us see. Not lightly is the veil rent, yet I will rend it a little, and show you your capital city." Conan did not see what she cast upon the fire, but the wolf whimpered in his dreams, and the green smoke gathered and billowed up into the hut. And as he watched, the walls and ceiling of the hut seemed to widen, to grow remote and vanish, merging with infinite immensities. The smoke rolled about him, blotting out everything, and in it forms moved and faded, and stood out in startling clarity. He stared at the familiar towers and streets of Tarantia, where a mob seethed and screamed, and at the same time he was somehow able to see the banners of Nemedia moving inexorably westward through the smoke and flame of a pillaged land. In the great square of Tarantia, the frantic throng milled and yammered, screaming that the king was dead, that the barons were girding themselves to divide the land between them, and that the rule of a king, even of Valkyrius, was better than anarchy. Prospero, shining in his armor, rode among them, trying to pacify them, bidding them trust Count Trocchero, urging them to man the wall and aid his knights in defending the city. They turned on him, shrieking with fear and unreasoning rage, howling that he was Trocchero's butcher, a more evil foe than Amalric himself. Offal and stones were hurled at his knights. A slight blurring of the picture that might have denoted a passing of time, and then Conan saw Prospero and his knights filing out of the gates and spurring southward. Behind him the city was in an uproar. "Fools," muttered Conan thickly. "Fools! Why could they not trust Prospero? Zalata, if you are making game of me with some trickery—" "This has passed," answered Zalata imperturbably, though somberly. "It was the evening of the day that has passed when Prospero rode out of Tarantia with the hosts of Amalric almost within sight. From the walls men saw the flame of their pillaging, so I read it in the smoke. At sunset the Nemedians rode into Tarantia unopposed. Look, even now, in the royal hall of Tarantia." Abruptly, Conan was looking into the great coronation hall. Valerius stood on the regal dais, clad in ermine robes, and Amalric, still in his dusty, blood-stained armor, placed a rich and gleaming circlet on his yellow locks, the crown of Aquilonia. The people cheered. Long lines of steel-clad Nemedian warriors looked grimly on, and nobles long in disfavor at Conan's court strutted and swaggered with the emblem of Valerius on their sleeves. "Crum!" It was an explosive imprecation from Conan's lips as he started up, his great fists clenched into hammers, his veins on his temples knotting, his features convulsed. "A Nemedian placing the crown of Aquilonia on that renegade in the royal hall of Tarantia?" As if dispelled by his violence, the smoke faded, and he saw Zalata's black eyes gleaming at him through the mist. "You have seen. The people of your capital have forfeited the freedom you won for them by sweat and blood. They have sold themselves to the slavers and the butchers. They have shown that they do not trust their destiny. Can you rely upon them for the winning back of your kingdom?" "They thought I was dead," he grunted, recovering some of his poise. "I have no son. Men can't be governed by a memory. What if the Nemedians have taken Tarantia? There still remain the provinces, the barons, and the people of the countryside. Valerius has won an empty glory." "You are stubborn, as befits a fighter. I cannot show you the future. I cannot show you all the past. Nay, I show you nothing. I merely make you see windows opened in the veil by powers unguessed. Would you look into the past for a clue of the present? Aye. He seated himself abruptly. Again the green smoke rose and billowed. Again images unfolded before him, this time alien and seemingly irrelevant. He saw great towering black walls, pedestals half hidden in the shadows upholding images of hideous half-bestial gods. Men moved in the shadows, dark, wiry men clad in red silken loincloths. They were bearing a green jade sarcophagus along a gigantic black corridor. But before he could tell much about what he saw, the scene shifted. He saw a cavern, dim, shadowy, and haunted with a strange, intangible horror. On an altar of black stone stood a curious golden vessel, shaped like the shell of a scallop. Into this cavern came some of the same dark, wiry men who had borne the mummy case. They seized the golden vessel, and then the shadows swirled around them, and what happened he could not say. But he saw a glimmer in a whirl of darkness, like a ball of living fire. Then the smoke was only smoke, drifting up from the fire of tamarisk chunks, thinning and fading. "But what does this portend?" he demanded, bewildered. "What I saw in Tarantia I can understand, but what means this glimpse of Zamorian thieves sneaking through a subterranean temple of Set in Stygia? And that cavern, I've never seen or heard of anything like it in all my wanderings. If you can show me that much, these threads of vision which mean nothing, disjointed, why can you not show me all that is to occur?" Zelata stirred the fire without replying. "These things are governed by immutable laws," she said at last. "I cannot make you understand. I do not altogether understand myself, though I have sought wisdom in the silences of the high places for more years than I can remember. I cannot save you, though I would if I might. Man must at last work out his own salvation. Yet perhaps wisdom may come to me in dreams, and in the morn I may be able to give you the clue to the enigma." "What enigma?" he demanded. "The mystery that confronts you, whereby you have lost a kingdom," she answered. And then she spread a sheepskin upon the floor before the hearth. "Sleep," she said briefly. Without a word he stretched himself upon it and sank into restless but deep sleep through which phantoms moved silently and monstrous shapeless shadows crept. Once, limned against a purple sunless horizon, he saw the mighty walls and towers of a great city such as rose nowhere on the waking earth he knew. Its colossal pylons and purple minarets lifted toward the stars, and over it, floating like a giant mirage, hovered the bearded countenance of the man Zaltoten. Conan woke in the chill whiteness of early dawn to see Zelata crouched beside the tiny fire. He had not awakened once in the night, and the sound of the great wolf leaving or entering should have roused him. Yet the wolf was there beside the hearth with its shaggy coat wet with dew, and with more than dew. Blood glistened wetly amid the thick fell, and there was a cut upon his shoulder. Zelata nodded without looking around, as if reading the thoughts of her royal guest. "He has hunted before dawn, and red was the hunting. I think the man who hunted a king will hunt no more, neither man nor beast." Conan stared at the great beast with strange fascination as he moved to take the food Zelata offered him. "When I come to my throne again, I won't forget," he said briefly. "You've befriended me. By Crom, I can't remember when I've lain down and slept at the mercy of man or woman as I did last night. But what of the riddle you would read me this morn?" A long silence ensued, in which the crackle of the tamarisks was loud on the hearth. "Find the heart of your kingdom," she said at last. "There lies your defeat and your power. You fight more than mortal men. You will not press the throne again unless you find the heart of your kingdom." "Do you mean the city of Tarantia?" he asked. She shook her head. "I am but an oracle, through whose lips the gods speak. My lips are sealed by them, lest I speak too much. You must find the heart of your kingdom. I can say no more. My lips are opened and sealed by the gods." Dawn was still white on the peaks when Conan rode westward. A glance back showed him Zalata standing in the door of her hut, inscrutable as ever, the great wolf beside her. A gray sky arched overhead, and a moaning wind was chilled with a promise of winter. Brown leaves fluttered slowly down from the bare branches, sifting upon his mailed shoulders. All day he pushed through the hills, avoiding roads and villages. Toward nightfall, he began to drop down from the heights tier by tier, and saw the broad plains of Aquilonia spread out beneath him. Villages and farms lay close to the foot of the hills on the western side of the mountains. For half a century, most of the raiding across the frontier had been done by the Aquilonians, but now only embers and ashes showed where farm huts and villas had stood. In the gathering darkness, Conan rode slowly on. There was little fear of discovery, which he dreaded from friend as well as from foe. The Nemedians had remembered old scores on their westward drive, and Valerius had made no attempt to restrain his allies. He did not count on winning the love of the common people. A vast swath of desolation had been cut through the country from the foothills westward. Conan cursed as he rode over blackened expanses that had been rich fields, and saw the gaunt gable ends of burned houses jutting against the sky. He moved through an empty and deserted land, like a ghost out of a forgotten and outworn past. The speed with which the army had traversed the land showed what little resistance it had encountered. Yet had Conan been leading his Aquilonians, the invading army would have been forced to buy every foot they gained with their blood. The bitter realization permeated his soul. He was not the representative of a dynasty. He was only a lone adventurer. Even the drop of dynastic blood Valerius boasted had more hold on the minds of men than the memory of Conan and the freedom and power he had given the kingdom. No pursuers followed him down out of the hills. He watched for wandering or returning Nemedian troops, but met none. Skulkers gave him a wide path, supposing him to be one of the conquerors. What of his harness? Groves and rivers were far more plentiful on the western side of the mountains, and coverts for concealment were not lacking. So he moved across the pillaged land, halting only to rest his horse, eating frugally of the food Zalata had given him, until, on a dawn when he lay hidden on a riverbank where willows and oaks grew thickly, he glimpsed afar across the rolling plains dotted with rich groves the blue and golden towers of Tarantia. He was no longer in a deserted land, but one teeming with varied life. His progress thenceforth was slow and cautious, through thick woods and unfrequented byways. It was dusk when he reached the plantation of Servius Galanus. 8. Dying Embers. The countryside about Tarantia had escaped the fearful ravaging of the more easterly provinces. There were evidences of the march of a conquering army in broken hedges, plundered fields, and looted granaries, but torch and steel had not been loosed wholesale. There was but one grim splotch on the landscape, a charred expanse of ashes and blackened stone, where, Conan knew, had once stood the stately villa of one of his staunchest supporters. The king dared not openly approach the Galanus farm, which lay only a few miles from the city. In the twilight he rode through an extensive woodland until he sighted a keeper's lodge through the trees. Dismounting and tying his horse, he approached the thick arched door with the intention of sending the keeper after Servius. He did not know what enemies the manor house might be sheltering. He had seen no troops, but they might be quartered all over the countryside. But as he drew near, he saw the door open, and a compact figure in silk hose and richly embroidered doublet stride forth and turn up a path that wound away through the woods. "Servius!" At the low call, the master of the plantation wheeled with a startled exclamation. His hand flew to the short hunting sword at his hip, and he recoiled from the tall gray steel figure standing in the dusk before him. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What is your mitra?" His breath hissed inward, and his ruddy face paled. "Avaunt!" he ejaculated. "Why have you come back from the grey lands of death to terrify me? I was always your true liege man in your lifetime." "As I still expect you to be," answered Conan. "Stop trembling, man. I'm flesh and blood." Sweating with uncertainty, Servius approached and stared into the face of the mail-clad giant, and then, convinced of the reality of what he saw, he dropped to one knee and doffed his plumed cap. "Your Majesty, truly this is a miracle passing belief. The great bell in the citadel has tolled your dirge. Days are gone.
Men said you died at Volkia, crushed under 1,000,000 tons of earth and broken granite. It was another in my harness, grunted Conan. But let us talk later. If there is such a thing as a joint of beef on your board... Forgive me, my lord, cried Servius, springing to his feet. The dust of travel is gray on your mail, and I keep you standing here without rest or sup. Mitra, I see well enough now that you are alive. But I swear, when I turned and saw you standing all gray and dim in the twilight, the marrow of my knees turned to water. It is an ill thing to meet a man you thought dead in the woodland at dusk. Bid the keeper see to my steed, which is tied behind yonder oak, requested Conan, and Servius nodded, drawing the king up the path. The patrician, recovering from his supernatural fright, had become extremely nervous. I will send a servant from the manor, he said. The keeper is in his lodge, but I dare not trust even my servants in these days. It is better that only I know of your presence. Approaching the great house that glimmered dimly through the trees, he turned aside into a little used path that ran between close-set oaks, whose intertwining branches formed a vault overhead, shutting out the dim light of the gathering dusk. Servius hurried on through the darkness without speaking, and with something resembling panic in his manner, and presently led Conan through a small side door into a narrow, dimly illuminated corridor. They traversed this in haste and silence, and Servius brought the king into a spacious chamber with a high oak-beamed ceiling and richly paneled walls. Logs flamed in the wide fireplace, for there was a frosty edge to the air, and a great meat pasty in a stone platter stood smoking on a broad mahogany board. Servius locked the massive door and extinguished the candles that stood in a silver candlestick on the table, leaving the chamber illuminated only by the fire on the hearth. "Your pardon, your majesty," he apologized. "These are perilous times. Spies lurk everywhere. It were better that none be able to peer through the windows and recognize you. This pasty, however, is just from the oven, as I intended supping on my return from talk with my keeper. If your majesty would deign..." "The light is sufficient," grunted Conan, seating himself with scant ceremony and drawing his poniard. He dug ravenously into the luscious dish and washed it down with great gulps of wine from grapes grown in Servius's vineyards. He seemed oblivious to any sense of peril, but Servius shifted uneasily on his settle by the fire, nervously fingering the heavy gold chain about his neck. He glanced continually at the diamond panes of the casement, gleaming dimly in the firelight, and cocked his ear toward the door, as if half expecting to hear the pad of furtive feet in the corridor without. Finishing his meal, Conan rose and seated himself on another settle before the fire. "I won't jeopardize you long by my presence, Servius," he said abruptly. "Dawn will find me far from your plantation." "My lord," Servius lifted his hands in expostulation, but Conan waved his protests aside. "I know your loyalty and your courage. Both are above reproach. But if Valerius has usurped my throne, it would be death for you to shelter me if you were discovered." "I am not strong enough to defy him openly," admitted Servius. "The 50 men-at-arms I could lead to battle would be but a handful of straws. You saw the ruins of Aemilius Scavenus's plantation?" Conan nodded, frowning darkly. "He was the strongest patrician in this province, as you know. He refused to give his allegiance to Valerius. The Nemedians burned him in the ruins of his own villa. After that, the rest of us saw the futility of resistance, especially as the people of Tarantia refused to fight. We submitted, and Valerius spared our lives, though he levied a tax upon us that will ruin many. But what could we do? We thought you were dead. Many of the barons had been slain, others taken prisoner. The army was shattered and scattered. You have no heir to take the crown. There was no one to lead us." "Was there not Count Trocchero of Poetan?" demanded Conan harshly. Servius spread his hands helplessly. "It is true that his general Prospero was in the field with a small army. Retreating before Amalric, he urged men to rally to his banner. But with your majesty dead, men remembered old wars and civil brawls, and how Trocchero and his Poetanians once rode through these provinces, even as Amalric was riding now, with torch and sword. The barons were jealous of Trocchero. Some men, spies of Valerius perhaps, shouted that the Count of Poetan intended seizing the crown for himself. Old sectional hates flared up again. If we had had one man with dynastic blood in his veins, we would have crowned and followed him against Nemedia, but we had none.
The barons who followed you loyally would not follow one of their own number, each holding himself as good as his neighbor, each fearing the ambitions of the others. You were the cord that held the faggots together. When the cord was cut, the faggots fell apart. If you had had a son, the barons would have rallied loyally to him, but there was no point for their patriotism to focus upon. The merchants and commoners, dreading anarchy and a return of feudal days when each baron was his own law, cried out that any king was better than none, even Valerius, who was at least of the blood of the old dynasty. There was no one to oppose him when he rode up at the head of his steel-clad hosts, with the scarlet dragon of Numidia floating over him, and rang his lance against the gates of Tarantia. Nay, the people threw open the gates and knelt in the dust before him. They had refused to aid Prospero in holding the city. They said they had rather be ruled by Valerius than by Trocero. They said, truthfully, that the barons would not rally to Trocero, but that many would accept Valerius. They said that by yielding to Valerius, they would escape the devastation of civil war and the fury of the Numidians. Prospero rode southward with his 10,000 knights, and the horsemen of the Numidians entered the city a few hours later. They did not follow him. They remained to see that Valerius was crowned in Tarantia.
Then the old witch's smoke showed the truth, muttered Conan, feeling a queer chill along his spine.
Amalric crowned Valerius? Aye, in the coronation hall, with the blood of slaughter scarcely dried on his hands.
And do the people thrive under his benevolent rule? Asked Conan with angry irony.
He lives like a foreign prince in the midst of a conquered land, answered Servius bitterly. His court is filled with Numidians. The palace troops are of the same breed, and a large garrison of them occupy the citadel. Aye, the hour of the dragon has come at last. Numidians swagger like lords through the streets. Women are outraged and merchants plundered daily, and Valerius either can or will make no attempt to curb them. Nay, he is but their puppet, their figurehead. Men of sense knew he would be, and the people are beginning to find it out. Amalric has ridden forth with a strong army to reduce the outlying provinces where some of the barons have defied him. But there is no unity among them. Their jealousy of each other is stronger than their fear of Amalric. He will crush them one by one. Many castles and cities, realizing that, have sent in their submission. Those who resist fare miserably. The Numidians are glutting their long hatred, and their ranks are swelled by Aquilonians whom fear, gold, or necessity of occupation are forcing into their armies. It is a natural consequence. Conan nodded somberly, staring at the red reflections of the firelight on the richly carved oaken panels. Aquilonia has a king instead of the anarchy they feared, said Servius at last. Valerius does not protect his subjects against his allies. Hundreds who could not pay the ransom imposed upon them have been sold to the Kothic slave traders. Conan's head jerked up, and a lethal flame lit his blue eyes. He swore gustily, his mighty hands knotting into iron hammers. Aye, white men sell white men and white women, as it was in the feudal days. In the palaces of Shem and of Turan, they will live out the lives of slaves. Valerius is king, but the unity for which the people looked, even though of the sword, is not complete. Gundaland in the north and Poetan in the south are yet unconquered, and there are unsubdued provinces in the west, where the border barons have the backing of the Bossonian bowmen. Yet these outlying provinces are no real menace to Valerius. They must remain on the defensive, and would be lucky if they are able to keep their independence. Here Valerius and his foreign knights are supreme.
Let him make the best of it, then, said Conan grimly. His time is short. The people will rise when they learn that I'm alive. We'll take Tarantia back before Amalric can return with his army. Then we'll sweep these dogs from the kingdom.
Servius was silent. The crackle of the fire was loud in the stillness.
Well, exclaimed Conan impatiently, why do you sit with your head bent, staring at the hearth? Do you doubt what I have said?
Servius avoided the king's eye. What mortal man can do, you will do, your majesty, he answered. I have ridden behind you in battle, and I know that no mortal being can stand before your sword.
What then?
Servius drew his fur-trimmed jupon closer about him and shivered in spite of the flame. Men say your fall was occasioned by sorcery, he said presently.
What then? What mortal can fight against sorcery? Who is this veiled man who communes at midnight with Valerius and his allies, as men say, who appears and disappears so mysteriously? Men say in whispers that he is a great magician who died thousands of years ago, but has returned from death's grey lands to overthrow the king of Aquilonia and restore the dynasty of which Valerius is heir. "What matter?" exclaimed Conan angrily. "I escaped from the devil-haunted pits of Belverus and from diabolism in the mountains. If the people rise..." Servius shook his head. "Your staunchest supporters in the eastern and central provinces are dead, fled, or imprisoned. Gunderland is far to the north, Powhatan far to the south. The Bosonians have retired to their marches far to the west. It would take weeks to gather and concentrate these forces, and before that could be done, each levy would be attacked separately by Amalric and destroyed." "But an uprising in the central provinces would tip the scales for us," exclaimed Conan. "We could seize Tarantia and hold it against Amalric until the Gundermen and Potanians could get here." Servius hesitated, and his voice sank to a whisper. "Men say you died accursed. Men say this veiled stranger cast a spell upon you to slay you and break your army. The great bell has tolled your dirge. Men believe you to be dead, and the central provinces would not rise even if they knew you lived. They would not dare. Sorcery defeated you at Valkia. Sorcery brought the news to Tarantia, for that very night men were shouting of it in the streets. A Nemedian priest loosed black magic again in the streets of Tarantia to slay men who still were loyal to your memory. I myself saw it. Armed men dropped like flies and died in the streets in a manner no man could understand. And the lean priest laughed and said, 'I am only Altero, only an acolyte of Erastes, who is but an acolyte of him who wears the veil. Not mine is the power but works through me.'" "Well," said Conan harshly, "is it not better to die honorably than to live in infamy? Is death worse than oppression, slavery, and ultimate destruction?" "When the fear of sorcery is in, reason is out," replied Servius. "The fear of the central provinces is too great to allow them to rise for you. The outlying provinces would fight for you, but the same sorcery that smote your army at Valkia would smite you again. The Nemedians hold the broadest, richest, and most thickly populated sections of Aquilonia, and they cannot be defeated by the forces which might still be at your command. You would be sacrificing your loyal subjects uselessly. In sorrow I say it, but it is true. King Conan, you are a king without a kingdom." Conan stared into the fire without replying. A smoldering log crashed down among the flames without a bursting shower of sparks. It might have been the crashing ruin of his kingdom. Again Conan felt the presence of a grim reality behind the veil of material illusion. He sensed again the inexorable drive of a ruthless fate. A feeling of furious panic tugged at his soul, a sense of being trapped, and a red rage that burned to destroy and kill. "Where are the officials of my court?" he demanded at last. "Palantides was sorely wounded at Valkia, was ransomed by his family, and now lies in his castle at Attalus. He will be fortunate if he ever rides again. Publius the Chancellor has fled the kingdom in disguise. No man knows whither. The council has been disbanded. Some were imprisoned, some banished. Many of your loyal subjects have been put to death. Tonight, for instance, the Countess Albiona dies under the headsman's axe." Conan started and stared at Servius with such anger smoldering in his blue eyes that the patrician shrank back. "Why?" "Because she would not become the mistress of Valerius. Her lands are forfeit, her henchmen sold into slavery, and at midnight in the Iron Tower her head must fall. Be advised, my king. To me you will ever be my king, and flee before you are discovered. In these days none is safe." End of side 2. To continue, change side selector switch and turn the cassette over. Side 3. Conan the Conqueror. Continuing at page 89. Spies and informers creep among us, betraying the slightest deed or word of discontent as treason and rebellion. If you make yourself known to your subjects, it will only end in your capture and death. My horses and all the men that I can trust are at your disposal. Before dawn we can be far from Tarantia and well on our way toward the border. If I cannot aid you to recover your kingdom, I can at least follow you into exile." Conan shook his head. Servius glanced uneasily at him as he sat staring into the fire, his chin propped on his mighty fist. The firelight gleamed redly on his steel mail, on his baleful eyes. They burned in the firelight like the eyes of a wolf. Servius was again aware, as in the past, and now more strongly than ever, of something alien about the king. That great frame under the mail mesh was too hard and supple for a civilized man. The elemental fire of the primitive burned in those smoldering eyes. Now the barbaric suggestion about the king was more pronounced, as if in his extremity the outward aspects of civilization were stripped away to reveal a primordial core. Conan was reverting to his pristine type. He did not act as a civilized man would act under the same conditions, nor did his thoughts run in the same channels. He was unpredictable. It was only a stride from the king of Aquilonia to the skin-clad slayer of the Cimmerian hills. "I'll ride to Poetan, if it may be," Conan said at last. "But I'll ride alone, and I have one last duty to perform as king of Aquilonia." "What do you mean, your majesty?" asked Servius, shaken by a premonition. "I'm going into Turantia after Albiona tonight," answered the king. "I failed all my other loyal subjects, it seems. If they take her head, they can have mine, too." "This is madness," cried Servius, staggering up and clutching his throat, as if he already felt the noose closing about it. "There are secrets to the tower which few know," said Conan. "Anyway, I'd be a dog to leave Albiona to die because of her loyalty to me. I may be a king without a kingdom, but I'm not a man without honor." "It will ruin us all," whispered Servius. "It will ruin no one but me if I fail. You've risked enough. I ride alone tonight. This is all I want you to do. Procure me a patch for my eye, a staff for my hand, and garments such as travelers wear." 9. It is the king or his ghost. Many men passed through the great arched gates of Turantia between sunset and midnight. Belated travelers, merchants from afar with heavily laden mules, free workmen from the surrounding farms and vineyards. Now that Valerius was supreme in the central provinces, there was no rigid scrutiny of the folk who flowed in a steady stream through the wide gates. Discipline had been relaxed. The Numidian soldiers who stood on guard were half drunk, and much too busy watching for handsome peasant girls and rich merchants who could be bullied to notice workmen or dusty travelers, even one tall wayfarer whose worn cloak could not conceal the hard lines of his powerful frame. This man carried himself with an erect, aggressive bearing that was too natural for him to realize it himself, much less dissemble it. A great patch covered one eye, and his leather coif, drawn low over his brows, shadowed his features. With a long, thick staff in his muscular brown hand, he strode leisurely through the arch where the torches flared and guttered, and, ignored by the tipsy guardsmen, emerged upon the wide streets of Turantia. Upon these well-lighted thoroughfares, the usual throngs went about their business, and shops and stalls stood open with their wares displayed. One thread ran a constant theme through the pattern. Numidian soldiers, singly or in clumps, swaggered through the throngs, shouldering their way with studied arrogance. Women scurried from their path, and men stepped aside with darkened brows and clenched fists. The Aquilonians were a proud race, and these were their hereditary enemies. The knuckles of the tall traveler knotted on his staff, but, like the others, he stepped aside to let the men in armor have the way. Among the motley and varied crowd, he did not attract much attention in his drab, dusty garments. But once, as he passed a sword seller's stall, and the light that streamed from its wide door fell full upon him, he thought he felt an intense stare upon him, and, turning quickly, saw a man in the brown jerkin of a free workman regarding him fixedly. This man turned away with undue haste and vanished in the shifting throng. But Conan turned into a narrow by-street and quickened his pace. It might have been mere idle curiosity, but he could take no chances. The grim iron tower stood apart from the citadel, amid a maze of narrow streets and crowding houses where the meaner structures, appropriating a space from which the more fastidious shrank, had invaded a portion of the city ordinarily alien to them. The tower was in reality a castle, an ancient, formidable pile of heavy stone and black iron, which had itself served as the citadel in an earlier, ruder century. Not a long distance from it, lost in a tangle of partly deserted tenements and warehouses, stood an ancient watchtower, so old and forgotten that it did not appear on the maps of the city for 100 years back. Its original purpose had been forgotten, and nobody of such as saw it at all noticed that the apparently ancient lock which kept it from being appropriated as sleeping quarters by beggars and thieves was in reality comparatively new and extremely powerful, cunningly disguised into an appearance of rusty antiquity. Not half a dozen men in the kingdom had ever known the secret of that tower. No keyhole showed in the massive green-crusted lock, but Conan's practiced fingers stealing over it pressed here and there knobs invisible to the casual eye. The door silently opened inward, and he entered solid blackness, pushing the door shut behind him. A light would have showed the tower empty, a bare cylindrical shaft of massive stone. Groping in a corner with the sureness of familiarity, he found the projections for which he was feeling on a slab of the stone that composed the floor. Quickly he lifted it, and without hesitation lowered himself into the aperture beneath. His feet felt stone steps leading downward into what he knew was a narrow tunnel that ran straight toward the foundations of the iron tower 3 streets away. The bell on the citadel, which tolled only at the midnight hour or for the death of a king, boomed suddenly. In a dimly lighted chamber in the iron tower, a door opened and a form emerged into a corridor. The interior of the tower was as forbidding as its external appearance. Its massive stone walls were rough, unadorned. The flags of the floor were worn deep by generations of faltering feet, and the vault of the ceiling was gloomy in the dim light of torches set in niches. The man who trudged down that grim corridor was, in appearance, in keeping with his surroundings. He was a tall, powerfully built man, clad in close-fitting black silk. Over his head was drawn a black hood, which fell about his shoulders, having 2 holes for his eyes. From his shoulders hung a loose black cloak, and over one shoulder he bore a heavy axe, the shape of which was that of neither tool nor weapon. As he went down the corridor, a figure came hobbling up it, a bent, surly old man, stooping under the weight of his pike and a lantern he bore in one hand.
"You are not as prompt as your predecessor, Master Headsman," he grumbled. "Midnight has just struck, and masked men have gone to Milady's cell. They await you."
"The tones of the bell still echo among the towers," answered the executioner. "If I am not so quick to leap and run at the beck of Aquilonians as was the dog who held this office before me, they shall find my arm no less ready. Get you to your duties, old watchman, and leave me to mine. I think mine is the sweeter trade, by maitre, for you tramp cold corridors and peer at rusty dungeon doors, while I lop off the fairest head in Tyrantia this night." The watchman limped on down the corridor, still grumbling, and the headsman resumed his leisurely way. A few strides carried him around a turn in the corridor, and he absently noted that at his left a door stood partly open. If he had thought, he would have known that that door had been opened since the watchman passed, but thinking was not his trade. He was passing the unlocked door before he realized that aught was amiss, and then it was too late. A soft, tigerish step and the rustle of a cloak warned him, but before he could turn, a heavy arm hooked about his throat from behind, crushing the cry before it could reach his lips. In the brief instant that was allowed him, he realized with a surge of panic the strength of his attacker, against which his own brawny thews were helpless. He sensed, without seeing, the poised dagger.
"Nemedian dog," muttered a voice thick with passion in his ear. "You've cut off your last Aquilonian head."
And that was the last thing he ever heard. In a dank dungeon lighted only by a guttering torch, 3 men stood about a young woman who knelt on the rush-strewn flags, staring wildly up at them. She was clad only in a scanty shift. Her golden hair fell in lustrous ripples about her white shoulders, and her wrists were bound behind her. Even in the uncertain torchlight, and in spite of her disheveled condition and pallor of fear, her beauty was striking. She knelt mutely, staring with wide eyes up at her tormentors. The men were closely masked and cloaked. Such a deed as this needed masks, even in a conquered land. She knew them all, nevertheless, but what she knew would harm no one after that night. "Our merciful sovereign offers you one more chance, Countess," said the tallest of the 3, and he spoke Aquilonian without an accent.
He bids me say that if you soften your proud, rebellious spirit, he will still open his arms to you. If not... He gestured toward a grim wooden block in the center of the cell. It was blackly stained and showed many deep nicks, as if a keen edge cutting through some yielding substance had sunk into the wood. Albiona shuddered and turned pale, shrinking back. Every fiber in her vigorous young body quivered with the urge of life. Valerius was young, too, and handsome. Many women loved him, she told herself, fighting with herself for life. But she could not speak the word that would ransom her soft young body from the block and the dripping axe. She could not reason the matter. She only knew that when she thought of the clasp of Valerius's arms, her flesh crawled with an abhorrence greater than the fear of death. She shook her head helplessly, compelled by an impulsion more irresistible than the instinct to live. "Then there is no more to be said," exclaimed one of the others impatiently, and he spoke with an Amadian accent. "Where is the headsman?" As if summoned by the word, the dungeon door opened silently, and a great figure stood framed in it, like a black shadow from the underworld. Albiona voiced a low, involuntary cry at the sight of that grim shape, and the others stared silently for a moment, perhaps themselves daunted with superstitious awe at the silent, hooded figure. Through the coif the eyes blazed like coals of blue fire, and as these eyes rested on each man in turn, he felt a curious chill travel down his spine. Then the tall Aquilonian roughly seized the girl and dragged her to the block. She screamed uncontrollably and fought hopelessly against him, frantic with terror. But he ruthlessly forced her to her knees and bent her yellow head down to the bloody block. "Why do you delay, headsman?" he exclaimed angrily. "Perform your task." He was answered by a short, gusty boom of laughter that was indescribably menacing. All in the dungeon froze in their places, staring at the hooded shape. The two cloaked figures, the masked man bending over the girl herself on her knees, twisting her imprisoned head to look upward. "What means this unseemly mirth, dog?" demanded the Aquilonian uneasily. The man in the black garb tore his hood from his head and flung it to the ground. He set his back to the closed door and lifted the headsman's axe. "Do you know me, dogs?" he rumbled. "Do you know me?" The breathless silence was broken by a scream. "The king!" shrieked Albiona, wrenching herself free from the slackened grasp of her captor. "Oh, Mitra, the king!" The three men stood like statues, and then the Aquilonian started and spoke like a man who doubts his own senses. "Conan!" he ejaculated. "It is the king, or his ghost. What devil's work is this?" "Devil's work to match devils," mocked Conan, his lips laughing, but hell flaming in his eyes. "Come, fall to, my gentlemen. You have your swords, and I this cleaver. Nay, I think this butcher's tool fits the work at hand, my fair lords." "At him!" muttered the Aquilonian, drawing his sword. "It is Conan, and we must kill or be killed." And like men waking from a trance, the Nemedians drew their blades and rushed on the king. The headsman's axe was not made for such work, but the king wielded the heavy, clumsy weapon as lightly as a hatchet, and his quickness of foot as he constantly shifted his position defeated their purpose of engaging him, all three at once. He caught the sword of the first man on his axe head and crushed in the wielder's breast with a murderous counterstroke before he could step back or parry. The remaining Nemedian, missing a savage swipe, had his brains dashed out before he could recover his balance, and an instant later the Aquilonian was backed into a corner, desperately parrying the crashing strokes that rained about him, lacking opportunity even to scream for help. Suddenly Conan's long left arm shot out and ripped the mask from the man's head, disclosing the pallid features. "Dog!" grated the king. "I thought I knew you. Traitor! Damned renegade! Even this base steel is too honorable for your foul head. Nay, die as thieves die." The axe fell in a devastating arc, and the Aquilonian cried out and went to his knees, grasping the severed stump of his right arm from which blood spouted. It had been shorn away at the elbow, and the axe, unchecked in its descent, had gashed deeply into his side so that his entrails bulged out. "Lie there and bleed to death," grunted Conan, casting the axe away disgustedly. "Come, Countess." Stooping, he slashed the cords that bound her wrists and, lifting her as if she had been a child, strode from the dungeon. She was sobbing hysterically, with her arms thrown about his corded neck in a frenzied embrace. "Easy all," he muttered. "We're not out of this yet.
If we can reach the dungeon where the secret door opens on stairs that lead to the tunnel, devil take it, they've heard that noise even through these walls. Down the corridor, arms clanged, and the tramp and shouting of men echoed under the vaulted roof. A bent figure came hobbling swiftly along, lantern held high, and its light shone full on Conan and the girl. With a curse, the Cimmerian sprang toward him, but the old watchman, abandoning both lantern and pike, scuttled away down the corridor, screeching for help at the top of his cracked voice. Deeper shouts answered him. Conan turned swiftly and ran the other way. He was cut off from the dungeon, with the secret lock and the hidden door through which he had entered the tower, and by which he had hoped to leave, but he knew this grim building well. Before he was king, he had been imprisoned in it. He turned off into a side passage and quickly emerged into another broader corridor, which ran parallel to the one down which he had come, and which was at the moment deserted. He followed this only a few yards, when he again turned back down another side passage. This brought him back into the corridor he had left, but at a strategic point. A few feet farther up the corridor, there was a heavy, bolted door, and before it stood a bearded Nemedian in corselet and helmet. His back to Conan as he peered up the corridor in the direction of the growing tumult and wildly waving lanterns. Conan did not hesitate. Slipping the girl to the ground, he ran at the guard swiftly and silently, sword in hand. The man turned just as the king reached him, bawled in surprise and fright, and lifted his pike. But before he could bring the clumsy weapon into play, Conan brought down his sword on the fellow's helmet with a force that would have felled an ox. Helmet and skull gave way together, and the guard crumpled to the floor. In an instant, Conan had drawn the massive bolt that barred the door, too heavy for one ordinary man to have manipulated, and called hastily to Albiona, who ran staggering to him. Catching her up unceremoniously with one arm, he bore her through the door and into the outer darkness. They had come into a narrow alley, black as pitch, walled by the side of the tower on one hand, and the sheer stone back of a row of buildings on the other. Conan, hurrying through the darkness as swiftly as he dared, felt the latter wall for doors or windows, but found none. The great door clanged open behind them, and men poured out, with torches gleaming on breastplates and naked swords. They glared about, bellowing, unable to penetrate the darkness which their torches served to illuminate for only a few feet in any direction, and then rushed down the alley at random, heading in the direction opposite to that taken by Conan and Albiona. "They'll learn their mistake quick enough," he muttered, increasing his pace. "If we ever find a crack in this infernal wall... Damn the street watch!" Ahead of them, a faint glow became apparent, where the alley opened into a narrow street, and he saw dim figures looming against it with a glimmer of steel. It was indeed the street watch, investigating the noise they had heard echoing down the alley. "Who goes there?" they shouted, and Conan grit his teeth at the hated Nemedian accent. "Keep behind me," he ordered the girl. "We've got to cut our way through before the prison guards come back and pin us between them." And grasping his sword, he ran straight at the oncoming figures. The advantage of surprise was his. He could see them limned against the distant glow, and they could not see him coming at them out of the black depths of the alley. He was among them before they knew it, smiting with the silent fury of a wounded lion. His one chance lay in hacking through before they could gather their wits. But there were half a score of them, in full mail, hard-bitten veterans of the border wars, in whom the instinct for battle could take the place of bemused wits. 3 of them were down before they realized that it was only one man who was attacking them, but even so their reaction was instantaneous. The clangor of steel rose deafeningly, and sparks flew as Conan's sword crashed on bassinet and hauberk. He could see better than they, and in the dim light his swiftly moving figure was an uncertain mark. Flailing swords cut empty air or glanced from his blade, and when he struck, it was with the fury and certainty of a hurricane. But behind him sounded the shouts of the prison guards, returning up the alley at a run, and still the mailed figures before him barred his way with a bristling wall of steel. In an instant, the guards would be on his back. In desperation, he redoubled his strokes, flailing like a smith on an anvil, and then was suddenly aware of a diversion. Out of nowhere behind the watchman rose a score of black figures, and there was a sound of blows, murderously driven. Steel glinted in the gloom, and men cried out, struck mortally from behind. In an instant, the alley was littered with writhing forms. A dark, cloaked shape sprang toward Conan, who heaved up his sword, catching a gleam of steel in the right hand. But the other was extended to him empty, and a voice hissed urgently, "This way, your majesty, quickly!"
With a muttered oath of surprise, Conan caught up Albiona in one massive arm and followed his unknown befriender. He was not inclined to hesitate with 30 prison guardsmen closing in behind him. Surrounded by mysterious figures, he hurried down the alley carrying the Countess as if she had been a child. He could tell nothing of his rescuers except that they wore dark cloaks and hoods. Doubt and suspicion crossed his mind, but at least they had struck down his enemies, and he saw no better course than to follow them. As if sensing his doubt, the leader touched his arm lightly and said, "Fear not, King Conan, we are your loyal subjects." The voice was not familiar, but the accent was Aquilonian of the central provinces. Behind them, the guards were yelling as they stumbled over the shambles in the mud, and they came pelting vengefully down the alley, seeing the vague dark mass moving between them and the light of the distant street. But the hooded men turned suddenly toward the seemingly blank wall, and Conan saw a door gaped there. He muttered a curse. He had traversed that alley by day, in times past, and had never noticed a door there. But through it they went, and the door closed behind them with the click of a lock. The sound was not reassuring, but his guides were hurrying him on, moving with the precision of familiarity, guiding Conan with a hand at either elbow. It was like traversing a tunnel, and Conan felt Albiona's lithe limbs trembling in his arms. Then, somewhere ahead of them, an opening was faintly visible, merely a somewhat less black arch in the blackness, and through this they filed. After that, there was a bewildering succession of dim courts and shadowy alleys and winding corridors, all traversed in utter silence, until at last they emerged into a broad, lighted chamber, the location of which Conan could not even guess, for their devious route had confused even his primitive sense of direction. 10. A coin from Acheron. Not all his guides entered the chamber. When the door closed, Conan saw only one man standing before him, a slim figure, masked in a black cloak with a hood. This the man threw back, disclosing a pale oval of a face with calm, delicately chiseled features. The king set Albiona on her feet, but she still clung to him and stared apprehensively about her. The chamber was a large one, with marble walls partly covered with black velvet hangings and thick, rich carpets on the mosaic floor, laved in the soft golden glow of bronze lamps. Conan instinctively laid a hand on his hilt. There was blood on his hand, blood clotted about the mouth of his scabbard, for he had sheathed his blade without cleansing it. "Where are we?" he demanded. The stranger answered with a low, profound bow, in which the suspicious king could detect no trace of irony. "In the temple of Asura, your majesty." Albiona cried out faintly and clung closer to Conan, staring fearfully at the black-arched doors, as if expecting the entry of some grisly shape of darkness. "Fear not, my lady," said their guide. "There is nothing here to harm you, vulgar superstition to the contrary. If your monarch was sufficiently convinced of the innocency of our religion to protect us from the persecution of the ignorant, then certainly one of his subjects need have no apprehensions." "Who are you?" demanded Conan. "I am Hadrathus, priest of Asura. One of my followers recognized you when you entered the city and brought the word to me." Conan grunted profanely. "Do not fear that others discovered your identity," Hadrathus assured him. "Your disguise would have deceived any but a follower of Asura, whose cult it is to seek below the aspect of illusion. You were followed to the watchtower, and some of my people went into the tunnel to aid you if you returned by that route. Others, myself among them, surrounded the tower. And now, King Conan, it is yours to command. Here in the temple of Asura, you are still king." "Why should you risk your lives for me?" asked the king. "You were our friend when you sat upon your throne," answered Hadrathus. "You protected us when the priests of Mitra sought to scourge us out of the land." Conan looked about him curiously. He had never before visited the temple of Asura, had not certainly known that there was such a temple in Tarantia. The priests of the religion had a habit of hiding their temples in a remarkable fashion. The worship of Mitra was overwhelmingly predominant in the Hyborian nations, but the cult of Asura persisted in spite of official ban and popular antagonism. Conan had been told dark tales of hidden temples where intense smoke drifted up incessantly from black altars, where kidnapped humans were sacrificed before a great coiled serpent whose fearsome head swayed forever in the haunted shadows. Persecution caused the followers of Asura to hide their temples with cunning art and to veil their rituals in obscurity, and this secrecy in turn evoked more monstrous suspicions and tales of evil. But Conan's was the broad tolerance of the barbarian, and he had refused to persecute the followers of Asura, or to allow the people to do so on no better evidence than was presented against them, rumors and accusations that could not be proven. If they are black magicians, he had said, how will they suffer you to harry them? If they are not, there is no evil in them. Crumbs, devils, let men worship what gods they will. At a respectful invitation from Hadrathus, he seated himself on an ivory chair and motioned Albiona to another, but she preferred to sit on a golden stool at his feet, pressing close against his thigh, as if seeking security in the contact. Like most orthodox followers of Mitra, she had intuitive horror of the followers and cult of Asura, instilled in her infancy and childhood by wild tales of human sacrifice and anthropomorphic gods shambling through shadowy temples. Hadrathus stood before them, his uncovered head bowed. What is your wish, your majesty? Food first, he grunted, and the priest smote a golden gong with a silver wand. Scarcely had the mellow notes ceased echoing when four hooded figures came through a curtained doorway, bearing a great four-legged silver platter of smoking dishes and crystal vessels. This they set before Conan, bowing low, and the king wiped his hands on the damask and smacked his lips with unconcealed relish. Beware, your majesty, whispered Albiona. These folk eat human flesh. I'll stake my kingdom that this is nothing but honest roast beef, answered Conan. Come, lass, fall to. You must be hungry after the prison fare. Thus advised, and with the example before her of one whose word was the ultimate law to her, the countess complied and ate ravenously, though daintily, while her liege lord tore into the meat joints and guzzled the wine with as much gusto as if he had not already eaten once that night. Your priests are shrewd, Hadrathus, he said, with a great beef bone in his hands and his mouth full of meat. I'd welcome your service in my campaign to regain my kingdom. Slowly, Hadrathus shook his head, and Conan slammed the beef bone down on the table in a gust of impatient wrath. Crumbs, devils! What ails the men of Aquilonia? First Servius, now you. Can you do nothing but wag your idiotic heads when I speak of ousting these dogs? Hadrathus sighed and answered slowly. My lord, it is ill to say, and I fain would say otherwise, but the freedom of Aquilonia is at an end. Nay, the freedom of the whole world may be at an end. Age follows age in the history of the world, and now we enter an age of horror and slavery, as it was long ago. What do you mean? Demanded the king uneasily. Hadrathus dropped into a chair and rested his elbows on his thighs, staring at the floor. It is not alone the rebellious lords of Aquilonia and the armies of Nemedia which are arrayed against you, answered Hadrathus. It is sorcery, grisly black magic from the grim youth of the world. An awful shape has risen out of the shades of the past, and none can stand before it. What do you mean? Conan repeated. I speak of Zoltoten of Acheron, who died 3,000 years ago, yet walks the earth today. Conan was silent, while in his mind floated an image, the image of a bearded face of calm, inhuman beauty. Again he was haunted by a sense of uneasy familiarity. Acheron. The sound of the word roused instinctive vibrations of memory and associations in his mind. Acheron, he repeated. Zoltoten of Acheron. Man, are you mad? Acheron has been a myth for more centuries than I can remember. I've often wondered if it ever existed at all. It was a black reality, answered Hadrathus. An empire of black magicians, steeped in evil now long forgotten. It was finally overthrown by the Hyborian tribes of the West. The wizards of Acheron practiced foul necromancy, thaumaturgy of the most evil kind, grisly magic taught them by devils. And of all the sorcerers of that accursed kingdom, none was so great as Zoltoten of Python. Then how was he ever overthrown? Asked Conan skeptically. By some means, a source of cosmic power which he jealously guarded was stolen and turned against him. That source has been returned to him, and he is invincible. Albiona, hugging the headsman's black cloak about her, stared from the priest to the king, not understanding the conversation. Conan shook his head angrily. You are making game of me, he growled. If Zoltoten has been dead 3,000 years, how can this man be he? It's some rogue who's taken the old one's name. Hydrathus leaned to an ivory table and opened a small gold chest which stood there. From it he took something which glinted dully in the mellow light, a broad gold coin of antique minting. You have seen Zoltoten unveiled? Then look upon this. It is a coin which was stamped in ancient Acheron before its fall. So pervaded with sorcery was that black empire that even this coin has its uses in making magic. Conan took it and scowled down at it. There was no mistaking its great antiquity. Conan had handled many coins in the years of his plunderings, and had a good practical knowledge of them. The edges were worn, and the inscription almost obliterated, but the countenance stamped on one side was still clear-cut and distinct, and Conan's breath sucked in between his clenched teeth. It was not cool in the chamber, but he felt a prickling of his scalp, an icy contraction of his flesh. The countenance was that of a bearded man, inscrutable, with a calm, inhuman beauty. "By Crom, it's he," muttered Conan. He understood now the sense of familiarity that the sight of the bearded man had roused in him from the first. He had seen a coin like this once before, long ago in a far land. With a shake of his shoulders, he growled, "The likeness is only a coincidence. Or if he's shrewd enough to assume a forgotten wizard's name, he's shrewd enough to assume his likeness." But he spoke without conviction. The sight of that coin had shaken the foundation of his universe. He felt that reality and stability were crumbling into an abyss of illusion and sorcery. A wizard was understandable, but this was diabolism beyond sanity. "We cannot doubt that it is indeed Zoltoten of Python," said Hydrathus. "He it was who shook down the cliffs at Valkia by his spells that enthrall the elementals of the earth. He it was who sent the creature of darkness into your tent before dawn." Conan scowled at him. "How did you know that?" "The followers of Asura have secret channels of knowledge. That does not matter. But do you realize the futility of sacrificing your subjects in a vain attempt to regain your crown?" Conan rested his chin on his fist and stared grimly into nothing. Albiona watched him anxiously, her mind groping bewildered in the mazes of the problem that confronted him. "Is there no wizard in the world who could make magic to fight Zoltoten's magic?" he asked at last. Hydrathus shook his head. "If there were, we of Asura would know of him. Men say our cult is a survival of the ancient Stygian serpent worship. That is a lie. Our ancestors came from Vendia, beyond the Sea of Vilayet and the blue Himelian mountains. We are sons of the East, not the South, and we have knowledge of all the wizards of the East who are greater than the wizards of the West. And not one of them but would be a straw in the wind before the black might of Zoltoten." "But he was conquered once," persisted Conan. "Aye, a cosmic source was turned against him. But now that source is again in his hands, and he will see that it is not stolen again." "And what is this damnable source?" demanded Conan irritably. "It is called the Heart of Ahriman. When Acheron was overthrown, the primitive priest who had stolen it and turned it against Zoltoten hid it in a haunted cavern and built a small temple over the cavern. Thrice thereafter, the temple was rebuilt, each time greater and more elaborately than before, but always on the site of the original shrine, though men forgot the reason therefor. Memory of the hidden symbol faded from the minds of common men, and was preserved only in priestly books and esoteric volumes. Whence it came, no one knows. Some say it is the veritable heart of a god, others that it is a star that fell from the skies long ago. Until it was stolen, none had looked upon it for 3,000 years. When the magic of the Mitran priests failed against the magic of Zoltoten's acolyte Altaro, they remembered the ancient legend of the heart, and the high priest and an acolyte went down into the dark and terrible crypt below the temple, into which no priest had descended for 3,000 years. In the ancient iron-bound volumes which speak of the heart in their cryptic symbolism, it is also told of a creature of darkness left by the ancient priest to guard it. Far down in a square chamber with arched doorways leading off into immeasurable blackness, the priest and his acolyte found a black stone altar that glowed dimly with inexplicable radiance. On that altar lay a curious gold vessel, like a double-valved seashell, which clung to the stone like a barnacle. But it gaped open and empty. The heart of Ahriman was gone. While they stared in horror, The keeper of the crypt, the creature of darkness, came upon them and mangled the high priest so that he died. But the acolyte fought off the being, a mindless, soulless waif of the pits brought long ago to guard the heart, and escaped up the long, black, narrow stairs carrying the dying priest, who, before he died, gasped out the news to his followers, bade them submit to a power they could not overcome, and commanded secrecy. But the word has been whispered about among the priests, and we of Azura learned of it. And Zoltoten draws his power from this symbol? Asked Conan, still skeptical. No, his power is drawn from the Black Gulf. But the heart of Ahriman came from some far universe of flaming light, and against it the powers of darkness cannot stand when it is in the hands of an adept. It is like a sword that might smite at him, not a sword with which he can smite. It restores life and can destroy life. He has stolen it not to use it against his enemies, but to keep them from using it against him. A shell-shaped bowl of gold on a black altar in a deep cavern, Conan muttered, frowning as he sought to capture the elusive image. That reminds me of something I have heard or seen. But what in Crom's name is this notable heart? It is in the form of a great jewel, like a ruby, but pulsing with blinding fire with which no ruby ever burned. It glows like living flame, but Conan sprang suddenly up and smote his right fist into his left palm like a thunderclap. Crom, he roared, what a fool I've been! The heart of Ahriman, the heart of my kingdom. Find the heart of my kingdom, Zalata said. By Ymir, it was the jewel I saw in the green smoke, the jewel which Tarascus stole from Zaltoten while he lay in the sleep of the Black Lotus. Hadrathos was also on his feet. His calm dropped from him like a garment. What are you saying? The heart stolen from Zaltoten? Aye, Conan boomed. Tarascus feared Zaltoten and wanted to cripple his power, which he thought resided in the heart. Maybe he thought the wizard would die if the heart was lost. By Crom! Ah! With a savage grimace of disappointment and disgust, he dropped his clenched hand to his side. I forgot. Tarascus gave it to a thief to throw into the sea. By this time, the fellow must be almost to Cordova. Before I can follow him, he'll take ship and consign the heart to the bottom of the ocean. The sea will not hold it, exclaimed Hadrathos, quivering with excitement. Zaltoten would himself have cast it into the ocean long ago, had he not known that the first storm would carry it ashore. But on what unknown beach might it not land? Well, Conan was recovering some of his resilient confidence. There's no assurance that the thief will throw it away. If I know thieves, and I should, for I was a thief in Zamora in my early youth, he won't throw it away. He'll sell it to some rich trader. By Crom! He strode back and forth in his growing excitement. It's worth looking for. Zalata bade me find the heart of my kingdom, and all else she showed me proved to be truth. Can it be that the power to conquer Zaltoten lurks in that crimson bauble? Aye, my head upon it, cried Hadrathos, his face lightened with fervor, his eyes blazing, his fists clenched. With it in our hands, we can dare the powers of Zaltoten. I swear it. If we can recover it, we have an even chance of recovering your crown and driving the invaders from our portals. It is not the swords of Nemedia that Aquilonia fears, but the black arts of Zaltoten. Conan looked at him for a space, impressed by the priest's fire. It's like a quest in a nightmare, he said at last. Yet your words echo the thought of Zalata, and all else she said was truth. I'll seek for this jewel. It holds the destiny of Aquilonia, said Hadrathos with conviction. I will send men with you. Nay, exclaimed the king impatiently, not caring to be hampered by priests on his quest, however skilled in esoteric arts. This is a task for a fighting man. I go alone. First to Poetain, where I'll leave Albiona with Trocero, then to Cordova, and to the sea beyond if necessary. It may be that even if the thief intends carrying out Tarascus's order, he'll have some difficulty finding an outbound ship at this time of the year. And if you find the heart, cried Hadrathos, I will prepare the way for your conquest. Before you return to Aquilonia, I will spread the word through secret channels that you live and are returning with a magic stronger than Zaltoten's. I will have men ready to rise on your return. They will rise if they have assurance that they will be protected from the black arts of Zaltoten, and I will aid you on your journey. He rose and struck the gong. A secret tunnel leads from beneath this temple to a place outside the city wall. You shall go to Poetain on a pilgrim's boat. None will dare molest you. As you will.
With a definite purpose in mind, Conan was afire with impatience and dynamic energy. Only let it be done swiftly. In the meantime, events were moving not slowly elsewhere in the city. A breathless messenger had burst into the palace where Valerius was amusing himself with his dancing girls, and throwing himself on his knee, gasped out a garbled story of a bloody prison break and the escape of a lovely captive. He bore also the news that Count Thespius, to whom the execution of Albiona's sentence had been entrusted, was dying and begging for a word with Valerius before he passed. Hurriedly cloaking himself, Valerius accompanied the man through various winding ways and came to a chamber where Thespius lay. There was no doubt that the Count was dying. Bloody froth bubbled from his lips at each shuddering gasp. His severed arm had been bound to stop the flow of blood, but even without that, the gash in his side was mortal. Alone in the chamber with the dying man, Valerius swore softly, "By Mitra, I had believed that only one man ever lived who could strike such a blow." "Valerius," gasped the dying man, "he lives. Conan lives." "What are you saying?" ejaculated the other. "I swear by Mitra," gurgled Thespius, gagging on the blood that gushed to his lips. "It was he who carried off Albiona. He is not dead. No phantom come back from hell to haunt us. He is flesh and blood and more terrible than ever. The alley behind the tower is full of dead men. Beware, Valerius. He has come back to slay us all." A strong shudder shook the blood-smeared figure, and Count Thespius went limp. Valerius frowned down at the dead man, cast a swift glance about the empty chamber, and, stepping swiftly to the door, cast it open suddenly. The messenger and a group of Nemedian guardsmen stood several paces down the corridor. Valerius muttered something that might have indicated satisfaction. "Have all gates been closed?" he demanded. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Triple the guards at each. Let no one enter or leave the city without strictest investigation. Set men scouring the streets and searching the quarters. A very valuable prisoner has escaped with the aid of an Aquilonian rebel. Did any of you recognize the man?" "No, Your Majesty. The old watchman had a glimpse of him, but could only say that he was a giant, clad in the black garb of the executioner, whose naked body we found in an empty cell." "He is a dangerous man," said Valerius. "Take no chances with him. You all know the Countess Albiona. Search for her, and if you find her, kill her and a companion instantly. Do not try to take them alive." Returning to his palace chamber, Valerius summoned before him 4 men of curious and alien aspect. They were tall, gaunt, of yellowish skin, and immobile countenances. They were very similar in appearance, clad alike in long black robes, beneath which their sandaled feet were just visible. Their features were shadowed by their hoods. They stood before Valerius, with their hands in their wide sleeves, their arms folded. Valerius looked at them without pleasure. In his far journeyings, he had encountered many strange races. "When I found you starving in the Khitan jungles," he said abruptly, "exiles from your kingdom, you swore to serve me. You have served me well enough in your abominable way. One more service I require, and then I set you free of your oath. Conan the Cimmerian, king of Aquilonia, still lives, in spite of Zoltotan's sorcery, or perhaps because of it. I know not. The dark mind of that resurrected devil is too devious and subtle for a mortal man to fathom. But while Conan lives, I am not safe. The people accepted me as the lesser of 2 evils when they thought he was dead. Let him reappear, and the throne will be rocking under my feet in revolution before I can lift my hand. Perhaps my allies mean to use him to replace me, if they decide I have served my purpose. I do not know. I do know that this planet is too small for 2 kings of Aquilonia. Seek the Cimmerian. Use your uncanny talents to ferret him out wherever he hides or runs. He has many friends in Tarantia. He had aid when he carried off Albiona. It took more than one man, even such a man as Conan, to wreak all that slaughter in the alley outside the tower. But no more. Take your staffs and strike his trail. Where that trail will lead you, I know not. But find him, and when you find him, slay him." The 4 Khitans bowed together, and still unspeaking, turned and padded noiselessly from the chamber. 11. Swords of the South. Dawn that rose over the distant hills shone on the sails of a small craft that dropped down the river which curves to within a mile of the walls of Tarantia and loops southward like a great shining serpent. This boat differed from the ordinary craft, plying the broad Korathas. fishermen and merchant barges loaded with rich goods. It was long and slender, with a high curving prow, and was black as ebony, with white skulls painted along the gunwales. Amidships rose a small cabin, the windows closely masked. Other craft gave the ominously painted boat a wide berth, for it was obviously one of those pilgrim boats that carried a lifeless follower of Asura on his last mysterious pilgrimage southward to where, far beyond the Poitanian mountains, a river flowed at last into the blue ocean. In that cabin undoubtedly lay the corpse of the departed worshipper. All men were familiar with the sight of those gloomy craft, and the most fanatical votary of Mitra would not dare touch or interfere with their somber voyages. Where the ultimate destination lay, men did not know. Some said Stygia, some a nameless island lying beyond the horizon. Others said it was in the glamorous and mysterious land of Vendia, where the dead came home at last. But none knew certainly. They only knew that when a follower of Asura died, the corpse went southward, down the great river in a black boat rowed by a giant slave, and neither boat nor corpse nor slave was ever seen again. Unless, indeed, certain dark tales were true, and it was always the same slave who rowed the boat southward. The man who propelled this particular boat was as huge and brown as the others, though closer scrutiny might have revealed the fact that the hue was the result of carefully applied pigments. He was clad in leather loincloth and sandals, and he handled the long sweep and oars with unusual skill and power. But none approached the grim boat closely, for it was well known that the followers of Asura were accursed, and that these pilgrim boats were loaded with dark magic. So men swung their boats wide and muttered an incantation as the dark craft slid past, and they never dreamed that they were thus assisting in the flight of their king and the Countess Albiona. It was a strange journey in that black, slim craft down the great river for nearly 200 miles to where the Korotas swings eastward, skirting the Poitanian mountains. Like a dream, the ever-changing panorama glided past. During the day, Albiona lay patiently in the little cabin as quietly as the corpse she pretended to be. Only late at night, after the pleasure boats with their fair occupants lounging on silken cushions in the flare of torches held by slaves had left the river, before dawn brought the hurrying fisher boats, did the girl venture out. Then she held the long sweep, cunningly bound in place by ropes to aid her, while Conan snatched a few hours of sleep. But the king needed little rest. The fire of his desire drove him relentlessly, and his powerful frame was equal to the grinding test. Without halt or pause, they drove southward. So down the river they fled, through nights when the flowing current mirrored the million stars, and through days of golden sunlight, leaving winter behind them as they sped southward. They passed cities in the night, above which throbbed and pulsed the reflection of the myriad lights, lordly river villas and fertile groves. So at last the blue mountains of Poitan rose above them, tier above tier, like ramparts of the gods, and the great river, swerving from those turreted cliffs, swept thunderously through the marching hills with many a rapid and foaming cataract. Conan scanned the shoreline closely and finally swung the long sweep and headed inshore at a point where a neck of land jutted into the water, and fir trees grew in a curiously symmetrical ring about a gray, strangely shaped rock. "How these boats ride those falls we hear roaring ahead of us is more than I can see," he grunted. "Hadrathis said they did, but here's where we halt. He said a man would be waiting for us with horses, but I don't see anyone. How word of our coming could have preceded us, I don't know anyway." He drove inshore and bound the prow to an arching root in the low bank, and then, plunging into the water, washed the brown paint from his skin and emerged dripping and in his natural color. From the cabin, he brought forth a suit of Aquilonian ringmail which Hadrathis had procured for him, and his sword. These he donned, while Albiona put on garments suitable for mountain travel. And when Conan was fully armed and turned to look toward the shore, he started, and his hand went to his sword, for on the shore, under the trees, stood a black-coated figure holding the reins of a white palfrey and a bay war-horse. "Who are you?" demanded the king. The other bowed low. "A follower of Asura. A command came. I obeyed." "How came?" inquired Conan, but the other merely bowed again. "I have come to guide you through the mountains to the first Poitanian stronghold. I don't need a guide, answered Conan. I know these hills well. I thank you for the horses, but the Countess and I will attract less attention alone than if we were accompanied by an acolyte of Asura. The man bowed profoundly and, giving the reins into Conan's hand, stepped into the boat. Casting off, he floated down the swift current toward the distant roar of the unseen rapids. With a baffled shake of his head, Conan lifted the Countess into the palfrey's saddle and then mounted the warhorse and reined toward the summits that castellated the sky. The rolling country at the foot of the towering mountains was now a borderland in a state of turmoil, where the barons reverted to feudal practices and bands of outlaws roamed unhindered. Powhatan had not formally declared a separation from Aquilonia, but she was now, to all intents, a self-contained kingdom, ruled by her hereditary Count Trocchero. The rolling south country had submitted nominally to Valerius, but he had not attempted to force the passes guarded by strongholds where the crimson leopard banner of Powhatan waved defiantly. The king and his fair companion rode up the long blue slopes in the soft evening. As they mounted higher, the rolling country spread out like a vast purple mantle far beneath them, shot with the shine of rivers and lakes, the yellow glint of broad fields, and the white gleam of distant towers. Ahead of them and far above, they glimpsed the first of the Powhatanian holds, a strong fortress dominating a narrow pass, the crimson banner streaming against the clear blue sky. Before they reached it, a band of knights in burnished armor rode from among the trees, and their leader sternly ordered the travelers to halt. They were tall men with the dark eyes and raven locks of the south. "Halt, sir, and state your business and why you ride toward Powhatan." "Is Powhatan in revolt, then?" asked Conan, watching the other closely, "that a man in Aquilonian harness is halted and questioned like a foreigner?" "Many rogues ride out of Aquilonia these days," answered the other coldly. "As for revolt, if you mean the repudiation of a usurper, then Powhatan is in revolt. We had rather serve the memory of a dead man than the scepter of a living dog." Conan swept off his helmet and, shaking back his black mane, stared full at the speaker. The Powhatanian started violently and went livid. "Saints of heaven!" he gasped. "It is the king, alive!" The others stared wildly. Then a roar of wonder and joy burst from them. They swarmed about Conan, shouting their war cries and brandishing their swords in their extreme emotion. The acclaim of Powhatanian warriors was a thing to terrify a timid man. "Oh, but Trocchero will weep tears of joy to see you, sire," cried one. "Aye, and Prospero," shouted another. "The general has been like one wrapped in a mantle of melancholy, and curses himself night and day that he did not reach the Volga in time to die beside his king." "Now we will strike for empery," yelled another, whirling his great sword about his head. "Hail Conan, king of Powhatan!" The clangor of bright steel about him and the thunder of their acclaim frightened the birds that rose in gay-hued clouds from the surrounding trees. The hot southern blood was afire, and they desired nothing but for their new-found sovereign to lead them to battle and pillage. "What is your command, sire?" they cried. "Let one of us ride ahead and bear the news of your coming into Powhatan. Banners will wave from every tower, roses will carpet the road before your horses' feet, and all the beauty and chivalry of the south will give you the honor due you." Conan shook his head. "Who could doubt your loyalty? But winds blow over these mountains into the countries of my enemies, and I would rather these didn't know that I lived. Yet, take me to Trocchero and keep my identity a secret." So what the knights would have made a triumphal procession was more in the nature of a secret flight. They traveled in haste, speaking to no one except for a whisper to the captain on duty at each pass, and Conan rode among them with his visor lowered. The mountains were uninhabited save by outlaws and garrisons of soldiers who guarded the passes. The pleasure-loving Powhatanians had no need nor desire to wrest a hard and scanty living from their stern breasts. South of the ranges, the rich and beautiful plains of Powhatan stretched to the river Alimane, but beyond the river lay the land of Zinkara. Even now, when winter was crisping the leaves beyond the mountains, the tall, rich grass waved upon the plains where grazed the horses and cattle for which Powhatan was famed. Palm trees and orange groves smiled in the sun, and the gorgeous purple and gold and crimson towers of castles and cities reflected the golden light. It was a land of warmth and plenty, of beautiful women and ferocious warriors. It is not only the hard lands that breed hard men. Powhatan was surrounded by covetous neighbors, and her sons learned hardihood in incessant wars.
To the north, the land was guarded by the mountains, but to the south, only the Alamein separated the plains of Powhatan from the plains of Zingara, and not once, but 1,000 times had that river run red. To the east lay Argos, and beyond that, Ophir, proud kingdoms and avaricious. The knights of Powhatan held their lands by the weight and edge of their swords, and little of ease and idleness they knew. So Conan came presently to the castle of Count Trocero. Conan sat on a silken divan in a rich chamber whose filmy curtains the warm breeze billowed. Trocero paced the floor like a panther, a lithe, restless man with the waist of a woman and the shoulders of a swordsman who carried his years lightly. "Let us proclaim you king of Powhatan," urged the count. "Let those northern pigs wear the yoke to which they have bent their necks. The south is still yours. Dwell here and rule us amid the flowers and the palms." But Conan shook his head. "There is no nobler land on earth than Powhatan, but it cannot stand alone, bold as are its sons." "It did stand alone for generations," retorted Trocero with a quick, jealous pride of his breed. "We were not always a part of Aquilonia." "I know, but conditions are not as they were then, when all kingdoms were broken into principalities which warred with each other. The days of dukedoms and free cities are past. The days of empires are upon us. Rulers are dreaming imperial dreams, and only in unity is there strength." "Then let us unite Zingara with Powhatan," argued Trocero. "Half a dozen princes strive against each other, and the country is torn asunder by civil wars. We will conquer it, province by province, and add it to your dominions. Then, with the aid of the Zingarans, we will conquer Argos and Ophir. We will build an empire." Again Conan shook his head. "Let others dream imperial dreams. I but wish to hold what is mine. I have no desire to rule an empire welded together by blood and fire. It's one thing to seize a throne with the aid of its subjects and rule them with their consent. It's another to subjugate a foreign realm and rule it by fear. I don't wish to be another Valerius. No, Trocero, I'll rule all Aquilonia and no more, or I'll rule nothing." "Then lead us over the mountains, and we will smite the Nemedians." Conan's fierce eyes glowed with appreciation. "No, Trocero, it would be a vain sacrifice. I've told you what I must do to regain my kingdom. I must find the heart of Ahriman." "But this is madness," protested Trocero. "The maunderings of a heretical priest, the mumblings of a mad witch woman." "You were not in my tent before Valkia," answered Conan grimly, involuntarily glancing at his right wrist, on which blue marks still showed faintly. "You didn't see the cliffs thunder down to crush the flower of my army. No, Trocero, I've been convinced. Zoltotan's no mortal man, and only with the heart of Ahriman can I stand against him. So I am riding to Cordova alone." "But that is dangerous," protested Trocero. "Life is dangerous," rumbled the king. "I won't go as king of Aquilonia, or even as a knight of Powhatan, but as a wandering mercenary, as I rode in Zingara in the old days. Oh, I have enemies enough south of the Alamein, in the lands and the waters of the south. Many who won't know me as king of Aquilonia will remember me as Conan of the Barakan pirates, or Amra of the Black Corsairs. But I have friends, too, and men who'll aid me for their own private reasons." A faintly reminiscent grin touched his lips. Trocero dropped his hands helplessly and glanced at Albiona, who sat on a nearby divan. "I understand your doubts, my lord," said she, "but I too saw the coin in the temple of Asura, and look you, Hadrava said it was dated 500 years before the fall of Acheron. If Zoltotan, then, is the man pictured on the coin, as his majesty swears he is, that means he was no common wizard even in his other life, for the years of his life were numbered by centuries, not as the lives of other men are numbered." Before Trocero could reply, a respectful rap was heard on the door, and a voice called, "My lord, we have caught a man skulking about the castle who says he wishes to speak with your guest. I await your orders." "A spy from Aquilonia," hissed Trocero, catching at his dagger. But Conan lifted his voice and called, "Open the door and let me see him." The door was opened, and a man was framed in it, grasped on either hand by stern-looking men-at-arms. He was a slender man, clad in a dark hooded robe. "Are you a follower of Asura?" asked Conan. The man nodded, and the stalwart men-at-arms looked shocked and glanced hesitantly at Trocero. "The word came southward," said the man.
Beyond the Alamein we cannot aid you, for our sect goes no farther southward, but stretches eastward with the Corotas. But this I have learned. The thief who took the heart of Ahriman from Torascus never reached Cordova. In the mountains of Poetan he was slain by robbers. The jewel fell into the hands of their chief, who, not knowing its true nature, and being harried after the destruction of his band by Poetanian knights, sold it to the Gothic merchant Zorathus. Ha! Conan was on his feet, galvanized. And what of Zorathus? 4 days ago, he crossed the Alamein, headed for Argos with a small band of armed servants. He's a fool to cross Zingare in such time, said Trocero. Aye, times are troublous across the river, but Zorathus is a bold man, and reckless in his way. He is in great haste to reach Masantia, where he hopes to find a buyer for the jewel. Perhaps he hopes to sell it finally in Stygia. Perhaps he guesses at its true nature. At any rate, instead of following the long road that winds along the borders of Poetan, and so at last comes into Argos, far from Masantia, he has struck straight across eastern Zingara, following the shorter and more direct route. Conan smote the table with his clenched fist so that the great board quivered. Then, by crom, fortune has at last thrown the dice for me. A horse Trocero and the harness of a free companion. Zorathus has a long start, but not too long for me to overtake him if I follow him to the end of the world. 12. The Fang of the Dragon. At dawn, Conan waded his horse across the shallows of the Alamein and struck the wide caravan trail which ran southeastward. And behind him, on the farther bank, Trocero sat upon his horse silently at the head of his steel-clad knights, with the crimson leopard of Poetan floating its long folds over him in the morning breeze. Silently they sat, those dark-haired men in shining steel, until the figure of their king had vanished in the blue of distance that whitened toward sunrise. Conan rode a great black stallion, the gift of Trocero. He no longer wore the armor of Aquilonia. His harness proclaimed him a veteran of the free companies, who were of all races. His headpiece was a plain bassinet, dented and battered. The leather and mail mesh of his hauberk were worn and shiny, as if by many campaigns, and the scarlet cloak flowing carelessly from his mailed shoulders was tattered and stained. He looked the part of the hired fighting man, who had known all vicissitudes of fortune, plunder, and wealth one day, an empty purse and a close-drawn belt the next. And more than looking the part, he felt the part, the awakening of old memories, the resurge of the wild, mad, glorious days of old before his feet were set on the imperial path, when he was a wandering mercenary, roistering, brawling, guzzling, adventuring, with no thought for the morrow, and no desire save sparkling ale, red lips, and a keen sword to swing on all the battlefields of the world. Unconsciously, he reverted to the old ways. A new swagger became evident in his bearing, in the way he sat his horse. Half-forgotten oaths rose naturally to his lips, and as he rode he hummed old songs that he had roared in chorus with his reckless companions in many a tavern and on many a dusty road or bloody field. It was an unquiet land through which he rode. The companies of cavalry, which usually patrolled the river, alert for raids out of Poetan, were nowhere in evidence. Internal strife had left the borders unguarded. The long white road stretched bare from horizon to horizon. No laden camel trains or rumbling wagons or lowing herds moved along it now. Only occasional groups of horsemen in leather and steel, hawk-faced, hard-eyed men who kept together and rode warily. These swept Conan with their searching gaze, but rode on, for the solitary rider's harness promised no plunder, but only hard strokes. Villages lay in ashes and deserted, the fields and meadows idle. Only the boldest would ride the roads these days, and the native population had been decimated in the civil wars and by raids from across the river. In more peaceful times, the road was thronged with merchants riding from Poetan to Masantia in Argos, or back. But now, these found it wiser to follow the road that led east through Poetan and then turn south down across Argos. It was longer, but safer. Only an extremely reckless man would risk his life and goods on this road through Zingara. The southern horizon was fringed with flame by night, and in the day straggling pillars of smoke drifted upward. In the cities and plains to the south, men were dying, thrones were toppling, and castles going up in flames. Conan felt the old tug of the professional fighting man to turn his horse and plunge into the fighting, the pillaging, and the looting, as in the days of old.
Why should he toil to regain the rule of a people which had already forgotten him?
Why chase a will-o'-the-wisp? Why pursue a crown that was lost forever? Why should he not seek forgetfulness, lose himself in the red tides of war and rapine that had engulfed him so often before? Could he not indeed carve out another kingdom for himself? The world was entering an age of iron, an age of war and imperialistic ambition. Some strong man might well rise above the ruins of nations as a supreme conqueror. Why should it not be himself? So his familiar devil whispered in his ear, and the phantoms of his lawless and bloody past crowded upon him. But he did not turn aside. He rode onward, following a quest that grew dimmer and dimmer as he advanced, until sometimes it seemed that he pursued a dream that never was. He pushed the black stallion as hard as he dared, but the long white road lay bare before him from horizon to horizon. It was a long start Zarethus had, but Conan rode steadily on, knowing that he was traveling faster than the burdened merchants could travel. And so he came to the castle of Count Valbroso, perched like a vulture's eyrie on a bare hill overlooking the road. Valbroso rode down with his men-at-arms, a lean, dark man with glittering eyes and a predatory beak of a nose. He wore black plate armor and was followed by 30 spearmen, black-mustached hawks of the border wars, as avaricious and ruthless as himself. Of late, the toll of the caravans had been slim, and Valbroso cursed the civil wars that stripped the roads of their fat traffic, even while he blessed them for the free hand they allowed him with his neighbors. He had not hoped much from the solitary rider he had glimpsed from his tower, but all was grist that came to his mill. With a practiced eye, he took in Conan's worn mail and dark-scarred face, and his conclusions were the same as those of the riders who had passed the Cimmerian on the road. An empty purse and a ready blade. "Who are you, knave?" he demanded. "A mercenary riding for Argos," answered Conan. "What matter names?" "You are riding in the wrong direction for a free companion," grunted Valbroso. "Southward the fighting is good, and also the plundering. Join my company. You won't go hungry. The road remains bare of fat merchants to strip, but I mean to take my rogues and fare southward to sell our swords to whichever side seems strongest." Conan did not at once reply, knowing that if he refused outright, he might be instantly attacked by Valbroso's men-at-arms. Before he could make up his mind, the Zingaran spoke again. "You rogues of the free companies always know tricks to make men talk. I have a prisoner, the last merchant I caught by Mitra, and the only one I've seen for a week, and the knave is stubborn. He has an iron box, the secret of which defies us, and I've been unable to persuade him to open it. By Ishtar, I thought I knew all the modes of persuasion there are, but perhaps you, as a veteran free companion, know some that I do not. At any rate, come with me and see what you may do." Valbroso's words instantly decided Conan. That sounded a great deal like Zarethus. Conan did not know the merchant, but any man who was stubborn enough to try to traverse the Zingaran road in times like these would very probably be stubborn enough to defy torture. He fell in beside Valbroso and rode up the straggling road to the top of the hill where the gaunt castle stood. As a man-at-arms, he should have ridden behind the Count, but force of habit made him careless, and Valbroso paid no heed. Years of life on the border had taught the Count that the frontier is not the royal court. He was aware of the independence of the mercenaries behind whose swords